Can you say test, test, test?
Test, test, test.
That's right.
There's an open chair.
I don't know what's going on.
Sound like it's on.
Test, test, test. Why isn't this working?
Plug it in.
I think Jim is.
Yeah.
Use that microphone.
No,
You're all good there.
I think that's more.
Lisa's not paper.
My understanding.
Alan's on your way. We got Alan here. Okay.
I think it's pretty well.
Sent to me yesterday at 5:30. I actually turned it down. And just put more people right up. All right, we're gonna call this meeting to order one more time. Tell them. Yes, it came in my lunch. You're on the record. Okay. So we'll leave a hanging chad when we around an issue that we had. I can't remember. All right, having found none, we're going to go into appeals. 4C, will be another easy one. Establish a professional board to hear Act 250 appeals and administer Act 250. This would restore the substantive decision-making of the former environmental board, but do it in a more efficient, streamlined fashion than the 9-member citizen environmental board currently does. This could be a 3 to 7-member board with members from legal and other professional backgrounds, bringing a much broader perspective to Act 250 appeals than one judge. I think that's, I'm going to guess it's the NRC. All right.
Said we don't have a 9-member environmental board.
Yeah, it should have said, like the former.
Okay. Commission members have questions for Mr. Groveman, or do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I mean, so basically, what this is about is, so, you know, the NRC and me personally, I've argued before the old environmental board. I've been in environmental court. I was chair of the NRB for a time. I've worked for state agencies that interface with the old environmental board and the environmental court. And, you know, based on our experiences and, you know, and looking at some of the data over the years, but even putting the data aside, really, it's become clear to us that the environmental court is the wrong fit for land use decisions like Act 250 makes. The environmental board that had 9 people, 9 members who were citizens, had an array of experience, were just better. They were better suited for looking at the criteria of Act 250, which, as you know, range from water and air and waste to planning to wildlife habitat to aesthetics. It's just a type of, it's more like why we have development review boards that are 3 to 5 members, that discussion and debate that goes on that on a sort of panel with varying perspectives, with people coming on and off it. There are terms to these positions, and you get, you don't kind of get stagnant in terms of sort of the people who are making the decisions, and that new ideas can come in. And what we have, there's been a couple of things that have been really lost going to the court that we were concerned about when the environmental board was eliminated, and the concerns have come to fruition. One is that there was a real strong link between the old environmental board and the district commissions. When there was inconsistency, when there were disagreements at the commission level about how to interpret our criteria, how to evaluate an issue under Act 250, the environmental board was able to resolve that dispute through their appeals and then communicate that clearly down through its administration of the district commissions. They were both making these appeals decisions and then meeting with the commissions and training the commissions and the coordinators and talking about the issues and looking at the rules. And that is really, that connection has been severed in a way, in sort of the same way, sort of that like planning commissions and DRBs, there has to be that sort of communication that goes on, and so that's something's been lost in sort of that connection between the strong central board and the district commissions. And then secondly, the courts tend to basically make decisions based on evidence. I believe this expert, I don't believe that expert. They don't really delve into how to really interpret and implement a criteria. In the early days of Act 250, the decisions about statics and the Queechy analysis, wildlife habitat, existing settlements, so many issues were really fleshed out in a way that Act 250, in our view, really calls for and continues to call for. And that's just not the type of decisions that you get from a court. That's just really just not what they're set up to do. And thirdly, it definitely is. Court is not an easy place for any citizen to interface with. It's an expensive process with full-blown legal discovery, and it's not an affordable process, and it's an intimidating process for any citizens to really enter. And boards are not panaceas for that, certainly, but an administrative tribunal is generally more flexible and able to accommodate the needs of citizens who don't have lawyers and don't have the resources to basically enter the court system. So basically, for all those reasons, we're recommending not going back to the 9-member citizen board which we had, except for the chair with Peter per diem, and 9 people are a lot of people to work with. So we were suggesting a smaller board and more of a model in terms of having a full-time chair, maybe part-time other board members, but to go back to more towards the older model for those reasons.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by this idea. One thing that seems to make sense to me is that the A&R permit appeals and Act 250 permit appeals go to the same place and currently. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about that, or if you could envision A&R permits going to the board if we were to shift away from the court for Act 250.
I mean, you certainly. So when the environmental court was expanded to go from hearing zoning and enforcement to A&R permit appeals and Act 250 permit appeals, one of the reasons was to consolidate permit appeals in one place. I think if you talk to developers and applicants, you hear some people still like that. I think some people have seen that has not created necessarily the efficiencies that you would intuitively think it might, because there are different standards for the different permit reviews, and it could create a longer court proceeding. So I would just note that I think it's an open question about whether or not that consolidation creates those efficiencies. But assuming that that it creates efficiency, then that's the policy that the legislature wants to pursue. Certainly, you could do that. You could certainly have a tribunal that heard A&R permits and Act 250. We're focusing on Act 250 because that's what this commission is looking at Act 250. But there's no reason why you couldn't create a board to do both. And In fact, that was one of the ideas that was on the table in 2004 when the environmental court was expanded. It was kind of back and forth. It was only at the very end of the session where kind of it was a mad scramble, and I was like, okay, the governor really wanted to go with the court, and that's where we focused on. But you certainly could have a board play that role.
Was that Governor Douglas?
That was Governor Douglas.
Has there ever been, since this shift occurred, a comparison as to whether or not it did in fact expedite permits?
We've done some analysis of VNRC a few years ago, and I need to dig that up. From what I recall, that you're not getting faster decisions out of the court, and this, definitely the expense of the appeals, at least from the citizen's perspective, has gone up, and I couldn't speak to the applicant's perspective.
Aaron?
You have from the NRB, and it's cited in the report, the last 5 years of the environmental board permitting and the average number of days. And I don't remember where that is. And then you have received, at least, I'm not sure if it's been given to the whole commission yet, the information that Jerry Tarrant updated, which has 5 years of environmental division appeals and the length of each appeal. Although we don't have, it could be possibly done. You could also get an average, what the environmental division has done based on that information. It hasn't. So this is in response to Paul's question, but I don't think you quite have the comparison yet, but you're almost there. Let's see, what we have on page 58 of the report is that from 1999 to 2004, there were 199 appeals, both for permit applications and jurisdictional opinions, to the former environmental board with an average processing time of 284 days. Page 60 summarized some data that I found about the environmental division, but it's not directly comparable, and what Jerry has submitted might be able to be refined into something that's directly comparable. I'm done.
Thank you. Jerry, do you have anything you want to add?
Sure. Just a few things. Is it okay here, or do you want me to sit over here?
If you want, I guess. I don't know how do what you want to do. Comfortable.
I'll sit over here.
Jerry Tarrant for the Bar Association. There's always going to be a debate over administrative tribunals and courts. There are constant debates in my office over judges when lawyers lose and when they win, and they have different opinions. I think the best you can do is hope for independence, fairness, and efficiency. And I think the court gives you that. I think numbers tell you a lot. I don't think they tell you everything. When I started last week to update the numbers, realizing that Aaron's draft didn't have those, I went to the court and we got the numbers. And so the numbers that you have are the numbers that I gave you in April, updated through November. So you have a 5-year period, except for this last month. Started in January of 2013. I guess I'd like to just take a moment to comment on the draft report that I hadn't seen until this morning. There were a couple things that I wanted to clarify. I think they're, maybe I'm misreading it. On page 59, it talks about the consolidation, which I think you just were referring to. It says near the bottom, in the last full paragraph, the consolidation authority has the advantage of one trial on the various permits that may apply to a project with all the parties and witnesses occurring in that one trial. I think that's true. As you'll see in the numbers, not all of the appeals are consolidated. The parties have to agree, and if they do, then there's consolidation, and it helps the parties that want to move in that direction and do it with that approach. It goes on to say, it carries a disadvantage of delaying resolution of appeals already filed while the division awaits potential appeals of other permits. True, but I think as you also heard today, many developers have always waited to go to Act 250 to see if they got their initial permits from A&R and the local municipality. Some didn't, but for the most part, most applicants that I've represented like to wait. Most cases that I represent other parties, neighbors, it seems like the applicant usually wants to wait because it's more efficient in a way, because they don't have to spend money on a case and try the same issues. And then if they don't prevail below, they have a separation issue, and they have problems. So they like to wait, and then they like to use the lower permits, the municipal permits, the A&R permits, as a kind of a presumption. And it makes it easier for Act 250. So I don't think that's entirely accurate. It's another one of those nuances. On the next page, 4 paragraphs down, it says, as with the former environmental board, appeals from the environmental division are to the Supreme Court, which reviews the case on the record. As discussed above, the Supreme Court applies the clearly erroneous standard to the division's factual findings and considers questions of law de novo. All true. Then it says, rather than applying the deferential standard, it applies on appeal from administrative agencies. I just want you to understand they don't refer to administrative agencies' decisions on the law. I think.
We may not agree with that.
Do you think that the Supreme Court defers to administrative agencies' decisions on the law?
Yes, they defer to their interpretations of their enabling statute and rules unless there's a compelling indication of error, and that's what I'm trying to take.
Okay, then that's the clarification, but not on generic laws that are applied, or procedures, or constitutional issues.
Not on any law that's not the agency's enabling.
Okay, all right, okay.
But usually it's the agency's enabling law that people are arguing about. I'm sorry, this is a lawyer's subtlety.
Okay, so that just needs to be clarified. As I said, I
Sure.
may have been reading it too narrowly. I filed yesterday a document with a memo. Attached to it are all the numbers. We did not average or aggregate or normalize or anything like that because I thought it would be better to just give you the numbers. When you average, of course, you get an average. And what we tried to do here was explain why some of the cases took a little bit longer, sometimes a lot longer, than what the guidelines provided. And you'll just see that some of these cases are cases that you'd never anticipate. Case where a resort contracted with neighbors to send people to the neighbors' homes to stay. And they'd be part of the process with the hotel. And the question by the other neighbors was it part of the hotel and did they come under Act 250? Something that's never been evaluated before at that time, and it brought in all the neighbors, the neighborhood, the hotel, and so that took longer because it was a case of first impression. And I just wanted to say, a number doesn't always tell you what you think it does. It's not because the trial court is spending too much time or is lazy or is slow. It's because these things take time, and I think you want enough time to make the right decision. So if you have the time to look at this, you'll see the cases that I identified, from the whiskey case at Whistlepig to the Burlington Airport case, which was unusual. I pointed out in one of these that there was a case in which it involved the Haystack Resort. And we went back and looked, and we found the original filing, the original decision. The whole resort is 3 pages. And so it'll give you an idea that when you cross a threshold, and wherever that threshold was, in the 70s or 80s or 90s, we're dealing with different things today than the way we did it 40 years ago, 50 years ago. It was a different state. I've heard lawyers, the older lawyers that I used to deal with, tell me that. We've crossed the threshold. When Walmart came in, the threshold had been crossed. But today, when you deal with cases, you're dealing with computer models. You're dealing with a lot of technical information, whether it be air modeling, traffic modeling, that kind of thing. You didn't necessarily deal with those things 50 years ago.
But do you think the courts are better suited to dealing with those technical things on the criteria of Act 250?
I think that when you read the information, you'll see that the old Environmental Board didn't have discovery. And so you need discovery in issues like that. I think it's those kinds of nuances that require a court to look at issues and allow parties to dig into and behind certain representations by experts. With all due respect to people who believe that experts all tell the truth, the difference between saying you have notice, comment period, and the right to appeal means you don't have a hearing and you don't have cross-examination. And this is where I would respectfully disagree with Annette. I've done a lot of cases where I've represented neighbors and we didn't have experts. What that means is you cross-examine. You have to prove your case through cross-examination. Because they can't afford $100,000. They can't afford to hire 2 experts. So what you do is you learn the issues, you understand them, you cross-examine, and you try to make your points. I'll give you a quick example. I represented the state on the wood heat plant across the street that the city wanted to do. Good project. A couple years later, I represented the neighbors against the wood project down the Sprinkler. Bad project. Why? That was for electricity. This is for heat. 3 times less efficient if you're going to use it for electricity. I had to prove that through cross-examination. You can do that if you learn the issues, or you can put a witness on it. It makes it more difficult for neighbors to do that. And they may have to hire a lawyer, they may not. But again, the issues are different today in some respects, but you can get around these costs, and you can do things effectively. When John says that administrative agencies are, for the most part, easier to deal with, you have to compare that to what Annette said. PUC is an administrative agency.
I never said the thing, man. I don't, just for the record, I don't know what you're talking about. That's not what I said.
So you said there
I
was
said
some
an administrative tribunal, which you would have cross-examination, and you could have discovery. I'm not talking about A&R, we're talking about like the public, where you went with those biomass cases to the professional board, right? Cross-examined people.
Well, sure,
Yeah.
sure.
So can you, I'm curious, since we're talking about John's testimony a little bit, like, he brought up some interesting points about the relationship of a professional NRB board to the district commissions and the ability to provide guidance, and that maybe has been lost by removing that authoritative role from within the NRB. Mike?
I'm not sure what the question is.
Do you agree?
Do you agree? Like, I mean, what's the downside from your perspective of having this be in the environmental court? I mean,
With relative to the NRB, you mean?
yeah, like what to weakening the sort of internal structure of the NRB and how it relates to the district commission.
I'm probably not the best person to testify as to the strength of the NRB. I've never worked there. I think what I've heard is that the old environmental board really had a good relationship with the district commissions and the coordinators. I'm not saying that the NRB doesn't today, but I've heard that it worked in sync pretty well. So I can't tell you today that the NRB doesn't effectively work well, because I really don't know. I've heard pros and cons about the NRB. I've heard negative things about it. Mostly that they're not as, that they're not as supported as well as they used to be. But I don't have the
Supported
details.
financially.
And staff-wise and that, but I heard Diane testify today that she felt they were, so I don't know. I know it's different, and I've heard complaints in the past. But I can't give you guidance on that. I think with the court today, it's a court that's a specialized court. If you go back enough years, we took appeals to the Superior Court. And the Superior Court didn't like zoning. They didn't like to deal with a lot of these issues. That was part of the problem back there. The judges didn't like to deal with this. And I always thought that was one of the reasons why the legislature felt that it should go to administrative board. We have two judges, Tom Durkin, who was a chair of a commission down in Brattleboro, and Tom Walsh, who was a general counsel at the Environmental Board. I don't know if Aaron was there or not, but so they have a knowledge of Act 250, and they've been judges for a long time, and they do work in this civil division as well. It's true that a court is different than an administrative tribunal. But I too practiced before the old environmental board, and the cases I was involved in, I can't remember cases where the other side didn't have lawyers. I'm sure there were, but the cases I had were fairly large shopping center, shopping mall kinds of cases, and it was always staffed with lawyers on both sides. The old board was a good board. It too changed over time. So when someone says the old board, the board, and compares it to the court, which board? Was it the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s? I think the numbers were different as you looked at it. It became more political. The one thing I like about the court is it's very difficult to affect the court politically. They read paper, they're human beings, but they don't take phone calls. And, I like that. I've had cases where I've lost before the court and I've won before the court. I think when you look at the statistics, you'll see some cases where the applicant has won, but the motions have been decided against the applicant in many cases, so that it narrowed things more favorably to the neighbors or to others. And it doesn't show up in the statistics because the applicant got a permit that was satisfactory. And the neighbors got what they wanted. And they did that through discovery and understanding how they can narrow those points to be more favorable to nearby neighbors.
Yeah, Peg.
Well, so the Vermont Planners has a broad membership that includes a fair amount of attorneys. So in this issue, our recommendation to you was not to try to decide it, but to recommend establishing a broad task force to examine the two things, because we had a strong contingent that would like to see a return to the quasi-judicial board that includes professionals and citizens. But there's also a contingent that would like to see a review of possible improvements to the current environmental division.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not sure I feel ready to make a decision on this.
So, but isn't our charge to, if we look at it and say, yeah, we looked at it, you should look at it some more?
We might do that on a couple things.
You don't want to do that too many.
We don't want to do it on too many things, but this one is, pretty big.
I will
You're
say,
reading something on my face and you're reading what you were looking at.
I was.
What you're reading on my face is
It's in your report.
further study.
He's in.
Is not, I'm reacting to further study when this is a study. It's your choice.
It's another commission.
one of the points that Aaron makes at the end is, he says a further option is direct appeal from the district commissions. Again, you have to appreciate that there's no discovery, and if that were true, they'd lawyer up. All sides would lawyer up before the district commissions.
I'm sorry, say again, direct appeal from the district commission
District
decision.
commissions to the Vermont Supreme Court. That is, eliminate the court.
Oh, wow.
Don't worry about an environmental board, just let the district commissions be the final arbiter, and then let appeals go up to the Supreme Court. What I'm suggesting, and I think this is true, is that you'd have a different district commission situation. There'd be lawyers opposing witnesses, filing motions to eliminate, cross-examining for hours, and it would be very difficult for the lay board, and it would not be especially productive for public participation unless you had lawyers.
Yeah.
Then that would be if it was appeals on the record. But if it was de novo.
Well, it wouldn't be
Well,
de
the
novo.
Supreme Court doesn't hear de
Yeah,
novo.
it wouldn't be de novo.
Yeah, Aaron?
Yeah.
So your charge includes looking at other appellate structures. So what I tried to do in the last couple of pages of this draft report is look at other possibilities. So the models that are here include a PUC-like model, a model that's based on the Environmental Appeals Board that EPA has, a model where instead of, you have a specialist court now, well, you could go to a generalist court, which, I'm just saying, these are all possible options. And another option is this direct appeal. I'm not disagreeing with Jerry's
Well,
view of the effect of direct appeal on the commissions. I think it would formalize them.
yes, okay, so I'm actually, thank you for drawing our attention back to the report. I think this one actually might be a good one for us to read the report and then decide what we think. Right, so.
I
Instead of
think
trying
it's
to.
good for you to read the report.
Instead of-
Tell me what I should change.
Yeah.
And Aaron called me yesterday, said he got this, and he asked me if I had averaged it, and I said no, and he didn't. But you can average it if you want to, but the numbers are all here, and it tells you which ones were consolidated and which ones were,
Well, I think that excuse me.
and how long, and how many went beyond the guidelines.
I mean, I'm just thinking like that, one of the things we've learned is that some of these appeals are just on jurisdiction, and they tend to spike the time and spike the cost. And so not averaging them kind of like makes, I get it.
Yeah, if you average them, you're averaging some without the jurisdictional, some, you can have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different kinds of appeals.
Yeah, right. So they would need to be
Yeah.
lumped. Okay.
What the NRB gave you includes, I guess it's a question of what data, if any, do you want to present, and how will they be comparable? Because you have data from the NRB that does average. I think they may have broken out the average by not, they have an overall average that includes all jurisdictional opinions and permit applications, and I believe that they may have broken it out by permit applications and jurisdictional opinions. I don't know whether we could do the same thing with what we have in the court. And I guess, or we could just not reference data. Now, it's a question, how do you want to discuss the handling of the data in the report? Would it make sense to average and have a range? Would it make sense?
Well, I think if we're going to average them, they should be by type.
That's what I don't understand. Is it possible to have them to weed out and have similar comparisons averaged? That becomes valuable, but I'm short of that.
I believe that the NRB has already done it by 2 different types. I don't know whether it's possible with what we just got. I just don't know.
what you'll see with my data is some are jurisdictional opinions, some are Act 250, and I broke those out. And then,
So it would be lost.
yeah, on those two, but then there are consolidated ones on both of them that bring in other appeals. So of all the number, there's, I think, 12 that were consolidated. So you have to go with the flow and understand that these aren't rigid comparisons, and get a sense. And again, to end this, I would say that you've been into a lot here. This is a big review. Like many things, the question is, how do you isolate a few really important things to see if you can get improvements without harming the rest? And that's the challenge that you face. I think we've given you the information for the court. I think it's a good court, and it's works. You'll see the numbers. They deal with a lot of cases, and they know it. And there was some reference in here that by Aaron that the courts don't have to, the judges don't have to follow what the other judge says or holds. But I think it's also fair to say that the judges follow precedent, and I think I'm not aware of cases where one judge went this way and the other judge went this way all the time. I mean, there may be a couple cases like that, but I'm not aware of it. They try to follow each other in the sense of precedent and follow the Supreme Court. So I don't see it being an unfair process in that sense.
Elizabeth.
I would just put in a humble plug for going forward to the public service style board, if for no other reason, so that there can be a link, a logical familial link between the public service board and what would be the environmental board or the natural resources board.
So separate from the appeals question, whether or not the professional board would take the appeals from the district commission's decisions, you would still advocate for a professional board?
Yeah, and instead of court.
Instead of court, instead of the environmental court, so 4 appeals, yeah, okay.
4 appeals and for the combination of the distributed generation projects that need Act 250 as well as public service review.
John?
Just really quickly, I just want to make a couple of points clear. So this is not about the judges, and it's not about could a court operate and do they work hard? They do work hard. And it has nothing to do with who the judges are, it's about the system. The question is, what's the right system to put Act 250 appeals through and to have Act 250 administered? You know, and so that's that. I just want to be really clear. This is just about, for Vermont, what's 50 years, this is the future of Act 250. What kind of system do we want? We've had an environmental board, citizen board. We've now, for 14 years, had this expanded environmental court. You know, we went from one to the other. I mean, people evaluate these things from time to time, and the question is, we've done this experiment, and how has it worked? And you have a divergence of views about what the best system is, and that's the policy question that's before the commission. And I think, you know, the arguments VNRC try to make are they're systemic arguments. They're not about, could you have a court do this? Of course you can, because they've been doing it. But what's going to work best to make Act 250 healthy and serve Vermonters? The other point, I think, in terms of, it's interesting, the data, in terms of, you have like these jurisdictional decisions that take up a lot of time. One of the advantages that we see to an administrative tribunal system is you can have hearing officers, you can break things off, different types of cases like the Public Utility Commission does. I think that really is a benefit to be able to, what kind of case it is, how big is it, free up the board time for other things. And anyway, so that's just another detailed, that's more of a detailed question, but I'll leave it there. But I just want the record to reflect that this is a systemic conversation. It's not about, you know, the judges or the, you know, themselves, or could the court work.
Ernie?
I think one of the cautions here is to take a look. there's two ways to do it. Look at, does this work or do we want something else? I would offer that I would first look at what we have now. How do we improve it? How do we make it more efficient? How do we make it work better? It's about timing. The other thing too is the process that has evolved has in fact evolved over the last 14, 15 years. And there was a reason it changed. It's in a legal, it is more legalistic, but I found it to actually work. And then what happens is most of the appeals go to the Supreme Court. So I am a believer that you have the same parallel legal system going into a legal system. I think they converge better. But anyway, my whole point would be, I would put a stake in the ground that what we have works, it needs to be improved, rather than changing it dramatically so and not sure what we're going to get. Given that this started 50 years ago, it was changed for a reason. If you go back to the original protocol, you've got to really reinvent a lot of stuff.
On that one comment, there's reference to the environmental board not using discovery, and a new professional board, I think, would need to be a fully robust process that would include discovery.
And then, of course, you get into motions and arguments over discovery. And that's what a court is really well equipped to handle, motions and limiting and things like that. And decisions which force discovery when the other side won't provide the information. So I guess I would just respond to what John said is, I prefer the independence of the court and the discovery, and that really makes it, to me, feel that I can win a case. You have that, you got a really good shot. If you don't, if it's just comments, then
Commissioners? Yeah, that, you growled on this one. What were you growling?
No.
What was the other one? Thoughts? How do you want to go forward? Create a new professional board, keep it the way it is, or recommend further study. Those are the three things I've heard.
I would recommend at this point keep that the way it is, because I don't think we have the grounds. Which is not to say we should.
At some point.
Yeah.
Did everyone hear what Dick said? No. Say it again.
I'm sorry, but I think we should recommend keeping it the way it is, because we don't have the grounds for changing it at this point. We've had a very large set of assignments to take care of, and we have not given the time and energy and attention necessary to justify advocating changing it.
You know, we had a subcommittee on this topic, and it was interesting how divided, you know, there really was.
When in doubt, stand back.
Leave it out there.
And I think that the next bullet item, John, goes with your one we were just discussing. Thanks, Terry.
What is the next item?
Very long. There could be a hearing officer to hear smaller Act 250 disputes to reduce costs and move
Yeah,
this complex.
yeah, that's if you had administrative back in there.
They go together.
Yeah.
See, I like this part, you know.
You like this bullet.
Well, I mean, they don't work, they have to work together,
Together.
but this is a
Right.
reason to shift back to the tribunal with changes. I mean, discovery's been highlighted.
You know, one of the things that drives Act 250 is the citizens' involvement, and certainly a hearing an appeal by a group of citizens seems to be in keeping with that attitude. I mean, I'm very much like that idea, although Jerry's comments were well taken, but it's difficult to know what to, exactly, if we're gonna make a decision, we wanna make a decision, we're gonna make it better. Of it seems to me, are more accessible, and I kind of in a betwixt and between attitude. I'm kind of going now with Dick, letting it alone.
Elizabeth, you look like you wanna.
You look like I want to say something. I would say, keep the door open to looking at a public service style board, a quasi-judicial board. It's not going back to the citizen board. It's coming into a form that would be compatible with the public service board, which I think is really important.
And I guess I'm struck by Annette's presentation and how this, if you had a shared process that was equal, you could have professional environmental board that worked with the Public Utility Commission on siting of energy projects. I mean, it's kind of what you, I think, in a way.
One of my observations is that what we have now with the system is that we have inconsistent land use decisions. So there is no consistency regarding ag soils, wetlands, which you have to mitigate in Act 250, which you do not have to mitigate at the PUC. The aesthetics criteria are not being properly applied at the PUC. There are many other criteria that are sort of given short shrift there. It's sort of a quickie review, as Billy Coster pointed out to me, though, that they do look at some criteria, like connectivity and forest fragmentation, that I support having. But I would like to see more consistency in the decision-making through, I would even suggest ag appeals be heard by the same professional board. I think that we are long overdue to have a land use panel that reviews all appeals of everything, so that we do have a consistent decision-making process.
Peg?
Well, what rang for me is Jerry Tarrant's comment that the mandate that you were given in this is enormous, and this is like the last issue on the table. It's a big issue just by itself, and that's why the planners just came down with their study, with their small subcommittee was divided. Just came down to look at this in a broader way and get more information.
Yeah.
It's consistently divided, right? I mean, remarkably divided.
I think it is, but I guess I'm starting to wonder about if we're gonna bring in some level of what Annette brought to us around consistent land use review. Then I think you'd wanna have a professional environmental board that was on par with the PUC to help with that work.
You might want it the other way around. PUC isn't very good on environmental matters.
But that's why I'm saying this board would be advising on the environmental matters while the PUC stuck to their energy role.
Well, I mean, that's something that you want to look at down the road is, should the PUC be involved in environmental issues like they have been over the last 10 or 15 years? They weren't set up that way. It used to be, they were a numbers commission for rates and transmission. And they got hit with all of these things. They had no idea what they were doing, truly.
Right.
And I apologize, whoever's listening from the PUC, but they didn't. And if it is legitimate for the legislature to understand whether the PUC should continue. Now, today they have a chair, Tony Roisman, who is an environmentalist. It's interesting. But it took him a long time to get to that point. And I don't, he's not going to be there for much longer. They're a numbers company that looks at rates and transmission issues. You may want to look at how those kinds of environmental issues and planning, land use planning, should be handled. And they should probably be handled by district commissions. And it makes sense.
Yeah.
Diane, can you just remind us how many people work under you?
I'm sorry?
How many people-
25 employees?
and I think the PUC has 70 roughly earned.
I don't think they have 70.
No?
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
The staff list
They think they
fits
have
on one
probably-
page,
Okay.
not very long.
Probably, not more, I would guess not more than 30, 35. But they're all housed in the office in Montpelier, and they have various expertise, lawyers, economists, utility analysts, and they can serve as, the staff can serve as hearing officers. The Act 250 has a more dispersed set of personnel, and the coordinators, they often have some kind of relevant background. They don't serve as hearing officers, and they are coordinators. They coordinate in the applications.
And appeals to the PUC go to,
Appeals from the PUC goes-
straight to the Supreme Court.
Which is one reason why it's more formal than district commissions.
There's an issue there for you to continue to look at. You know, as I said on the wind issue the other day, I mean, there's probably a reason to separate the wind because it's so different from all other issues, but the PUC is not the best on environmental issues.
They have 25 employees.
PUC? Thank you.
Right there.
I mean, we're not going to come to one conclusion, but maybe we can the report and summarize. I mean, as we're going to do where we're punching, summarize some of the considerations. And there are real pluses and minuses.
So we've had a lot of discussion. You guys got all the discussion?
No.
Do we have a recommendation that we want to endorse on how to move forward on this complicated?
Well, I mean, to me, we would say there was no clear consensus emerging. You know, there's value, this value going here, there's this value here, here's some of the data. You know, I don't know how we can better. We can't take consistently divided points of view and pull it into a consensus on our own, right? Let's see how that's possible.
Peg, what page is the planner's recommendation on?
Sorry. It's, on page 14, at the very end.
Establish an interagency task force or work group to evaluate alternatives for improvements to the current appeals process.
Yeah, I would, personally, I wouldn't agree with an interagency task force. It seems like it should be a broad task force that includes the world of citizens. But it's not a return to, you know, the environmental board as it was, but, something that's more quasi-judicial, similar to the environmental board, but it just seems like there should be more evaluative process on this whole thing. With the discussion on the PUC and the old environmental board and current environmental court. I don't believe the planners have been thoroughly pleased with all the decisions that come out of the environmental division in terms of consistency and
You know where we're at.
Not pleased?
Well, you know, the idea is that, you know, we can't come down on one side or the other. And so consequently, if you had something that was looking at it to evaluate more alternatives, I don't know, maybe it's just kicking the can down the road, but, I mean, barring that, I would, if I was hard pressed to choose one, I would say I'd go one and chick and stay with what we've got. 'Cause I haven't had any really overwhelming or overriding reasons to change it yet.
Well, I guess I come back to what Annette presented to us, which we also kind of put back. And the reason we put it up till now is because it's related to this.
Mhm.
And it's like, how do we think energy siting should be reviewed in this process? And if we want to change the way the land use part of energy siting is considered, this is one of those avenues forward to do it. Maybe the only one I've heard so far.
I guess I'd chip in and say that if you do, consider the cost of going to both the PUC on technical, transmission, need issues, and a site plan land use tribunal for siting. You want one, I think, and maybe you could do that with a site planning, land use review, and then have the utility come in and testify as to the interconnection and things like that. As I said, the other approach is to look at wind.
Can you just rewind? I have a question. Why would you want one? I don't know. I mean,
Well, I'm just saying, you have to be sensitive to the costs of going to both the PUC and for the applicant.
oh, I think that, oh, I see, one process. Oh,
Yeah,
I'm
one process.
imagining it as one process. Yeah, okay. I think
We have video recorded so many PUC hearings. And I think my favorite one is a 150 kilowatt project that was entirely about where to plant screening trees to shield the solar array. If you count up all the lawyers and experts in that room, and each one is $5,000 to $10,000, I mean, it's an outrageous amount of money that the developers are spending at the PUC in these highly litigatory process. Neighbors could sit around with the developers in a district commission hearing and agree to where to plant trees, and it would hardly cost anything compared to what's being spent by developers. I mean, part of my impetus for doing this is just seeing how much money is getting poured down that drain on land use issues. It's crazy.
So you're imagining if they were together, you would be able to avoid that early. You just deal with that issue earlier.
I mean, the developers right now who deal with utility, like, let's say solar projects, they have to go to the utilities for interconnection. Sometimes they have to go to ISO New England. They have to go to the Agency of Natural Resources. They have to go to the Department of Public Service. They're already used to having to coordinate what they're doing. And so having a land use panel that saves them money and results in a better, more efficient process, that's the hope, makes sense.
Elizabeth, and then, sorry, I'll keep going.
Just real quick, there is precedent with the waste facility panel to the environmental board once upon a time. It would be a parallel. So what you want to do is set up essentially an intervention with the other to get through the issues. And if you have them all on the same quasi-judicial level, it's easier to do.
I want to make 2 points. First, I'm not sure that the issue of appeals and the issue of how to handle energy facilities are
They don't need to be.
necessarily intertwined.
Yeah.
You asked me, I mean, whether or not you change the current Act 250 appeal structure, you can still change the energy review, and vice versa. The second thing is that on the energy review, last time you asked me for a couple of different options. Those are in the draft report and the draft legislation. One was for to separate merchant generation from utility generation, and that merchant generation would go through Act 250. That wouldn't do anything that wouldn't take away from the interconnection rules of the PUC that would apply in either case. And then the second option was the energy facilities above 2,500 feet of Act 250. And so in both of those options, that would be the district commission and the current appeal structure. That would all be separate from whether. So I'm not saying those are hang up wonderful options, but those are the options that we
And I
talked
guess,
about last
yeah,
time.
thank you for clarifying that the appeals doesn't necessarily have to go into this other conversation about how land use review happens around. But then I do get a little lost when I'm thinking about the role of the district commissions. If you had an environmental board that let's just say they did kind of what Annette proposed earlier, of having them review the land use portion of energy siting, where does the district commission fit into that?
It would be a regular district commission process. I mean, you've got a solar project that's proposed for this site, it would come in and the criteria would be used to evaluate it, and there would be a decision. And that would move to the PUC process. It would be what the
Oh,
developer.
so then it would be two, like Jerry was saying. That sounds like like you'd have to do two different things.
Well, the developers still have to do the interconnection and, I mean, and this, if I may speak to the idea of merchant versus utility, a lot of the utilities are now saying they can develop these distributed projects cheaper than the merchant developers, so there's a tension there. But you'd still have land use at the PUC if you did it that way. You'd still have land use issues. My sort of big picture view is move land use out of the PUC entirely, and how those two things interface would be similar to how they interface with A&R permits, and the developers would address these land use issues, and then they would get final, the CPG from the PUC.
I just want to point out that you don't, if you have the land use piece in Act 250, whatever it is, over some part of, or all of energy facilities, the other issues that people think about for PUC jurisdiction do not necessarily have to be handled through a CPG process. There are interconnection rules. It's an administrative process where the generator works with the utility to arrive at an agreed upon interconnection, and if there's a dispute, then they go to the board, the commission. So it's not necessarily that you have to have a land use review going into a CPG review. You might not need the CPG review.
Yeah, I don't know enough about
On
it,
emergent
but
stuff.
I'm seeing some nods from people who know.
Madam Chair, I really apologize, I have to go. I'm actually really late.
Happy
But I just want to like implore you to, in the report, keep the door open. I mean, it's true. I think there's a split. There's not consensus, but this is a really important issue for how Act 250 is going to function. I would hate to see like the door closed, whether it's for the issue you're talking about now or for the other issues we talked about before. So I agree it's a complicated issue and it deserves more attention. But I hate to see like the door shut and then we're just going to stay with the status quo because we ran out of time, basically.
Yeah, I hear you. Thank
So I
you.
apologize.
Thank you for coming. Dick?
Yeah, several people have said things along the lines of what I'm thinking, which is that we really are dealing with two different collections of issues and two different sets of questions. The public utilities regulators are supposed to answer the question, does this serve to provide adequate energy for the society's energy needs? Does it promise to do it at a reasonable price? And now, as the more aware and responsible we become on global warming, it's also does this do this in a clean way? That's an environmental issue, but it's specific to energy generation. Meanwhile, there's a whole other question, which is this a proper use of headwater, undeveloped wilderness habitat, high elevation areas? And I think that probably it makes sense that it's a misuse of the Public Utilities Commission to have them making those environmental decisions, other than the lack of greenhouse gases question, which probably properly is there. But it seems to me that we're sort of using the wrong tools for the job. And people have been suggesting for a couple of years that we move the whole issue of, say, ridgetop wind to Act 250. And I don't know if that involves questions other than environmental questions. The old, will this provide adequate electricity, and will it do it at a reasonable price? The other point I mean is if we have two different boards doing the same project, different aspects of the same project, we are likely to find a situation where one board says yes and the other says no. And we're gonna have to decide.
Appeal it to the environmental court.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me- in terms of ridgetop wind, if the question is, is this a good approach to making energy that's not gonna put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere? The answer is yes, usually. I mean, I presume that, and if that's what you're looking at, the answer is go do it. But on the other hand, there's the question of habitat, headwaters, wilderness areas, et cetera. So I would think that the environmental board may very well decide no. And I don't know how we would, but we're going to have to answer who presides over who prevails over whom.
We let the Senate do that.
Because we're the wise ones.
Elizabeth?
The solution to your two conflicting determinations would be to combine them as a whole. With the flexibility of hearing solely Act 250 or solely PUC related, power related issues. But distributed generation is a land use. And the sooner we treat distributed generation as a land use, the better off the environment will be. Okay.
But in the case of energy projects, it seems to me they almost certainly will not meet the general Act 250 process because we do them in spite of their impact on the landscape. They are worth it because we have to have electricity. It's sort of, to me, the way. And so Act 250 is not set up to say, well, it fails on aesthetics, it fails on habitat, it fails on other things, but it's worth it in the larger picture, which I think is why we've, somewhere along the lines, pushed it all to the PUC. And I don't understand how we deal with that. I mean, that's...
I think taking, I don't know if Aaron could speak to probably better than I, the waste facility panel and how that worked as a vehicle to connect with the review of waste facilities by a panel that was made up of members of the Environmental Board and members of the Water Resources Board, and called to perform a review based on the nature of the project, which is, a landfill or some.
Or weren't those already existing entities that they were?
It's just, it was a streamlining of the process, so it didn't have to go through two distinct boards. It could go through an amalgamation of the two boards. Do you remember, Aaron? Okay.
I remember it. I don't have anything to add.
Helping you kind of
They heard
move this
appeals.
discussion along. I believe that the legislature is going to be seeing a lot of proposed changes to our state's energy legislation, in particular net metering and standard offer and these distributed energy programs. And so perhaps as part of your recommendations, it could be something that says that there is a need to, I mean, this is too big a conversation for this meeting today, but there is a need to, as part of the review of how we are doing locally distributed energy, to look at the process that goes with it. Because there's a much larger conversation that's going to be happening in the context of this, and I will point out there are no utilities here, there are probably no renewable energy developers here. They need to be a part of that conversation too.
Right. Okay, that's a great summary. So here we are. I think we want to continue to have the conversation about this. I think pieces I want to capture are the land use panel. I mean, I think Annette presented us with some interesting points around other states having land use panels and we don't.
Have we moved from appeals to energy?
Well, so it's right, it's a good question. There's a couple of issues. So I was just starting with one. Where we started talking about appeals, yes. But this day started also talking about, maybe Natalie got there. Oh, we heard from Annette. Look at that. We started out talking about process and interface and permits and citizen engagement, which led us to this place of the land use panel, proposal to have a land use panel. Do you want to say something?
No, we keep going.
Land use panel
Mad.
specifically for energy projects or just?
Now I do.
Would we,
Well, I think there's a question of this professional environmental board that's out there, which could be the land use panel, and then, you know, I don't know what their other roles would be, and that's why I get a little lost in how does it relate to the actual district commission's role in a particular area of the state. So the recommendation needs to be that you know, there's enough here that we want to continue a process, a conversation. I think the planners have put it out there to make a proposal that we look into this.
Are we talking about appeals?
Yeah, what are we on, what they proposed on page 14, I'm sorry. The planners. Is that where
Well,
they at?
I guess I've added a heading of the Land Use Panel Professional Natural Resources Board that relates somewhat to it. I don't know how it would handle the appeals question. But I think if you guys want to talk about the appeals, finish that. We could say, what do you want to say about it, about appeals?
Well, I continue to not know precisely what we should say, but I appreciate John's point that we not be, you know, close the door.
Conversation's not over.
Right.
Because it wasn't people saying it's all good,
Right.
that's for sure, right? So, which is, it's frustrating, I feel like we're not meeting our assignment, but, so I would be wrong to conclude that there's no issue there. It also seems impossible for me to see how we would decisively decide what to do.
Right.
Yeah, if we're recommending legislation and putting out a bill for this session, it seems to me that as that works its way through the legislature, we're going to have the door open because there's going to be people coming in to testify as to what they've seen in the bill we're presenting, and also some of these issues that we can't quite come to grips with right now by ourselves will have the benefit of even more testimony and you know, a more exhaustive airing of the options we should be taking. I can't believe that any bill we put out is going to be pass without having any kind of amendment attached to it or any discussion or any kind of tweaking as we go forward. So, you know, I think there's some ideas that have to be further aired, and I'm kind of on that as far as the appeals go. That's kind of where I'm sitting. I agree with what John had to say about keeping the door open, but I think by the process that we're involved in, it's going to be open.
Yeah.
I don't know. I know it's kind of like a wishy-washy kind of approach, but I don't know what else to do about it.
All I'm saying is, and I agree with Senator McCormick, if we just say we're not ready to recommend a change, that's very different from saying we are satisfied with the current state.
Right. Yeah.
You know, and I'm just looking to include that somewhere.
Okay, we're not ready to recommend a change. Stating the obvious. Okay.
Now, do you want to talk about the energy
Yeah, right.
siting? What bunch of that? No, I
Yeah.
don't remember why.
Well, I mean, Aaron reminded us that we did discuss it last time, and I think do you want to tell us what page it's on? Is that where
It comes up in the existing charge in two different places. And therefore, the discussion is in both of those places.
Sorry, what page, Eric?
I haven't said what page yet, because I'm trying to find it. There is discussion of the electric generation issue on page 36 with, in the context of exemptions, because electric generation facilities are exempt from having to get Act 50 permit if they are subject to the PUC siting statute. And so on page 37, there's the notion of one option considered by the commission to place merchant electric generation facilities under Act 50 jurisdiction, and that this would treat merchant generation the same as other market-based development, but generation facilities with majority ownership by Vermont Utilities would remain under PUC siting, which is consistent with the PUC's regulation of these utilities. I mean, I'm writing in a vacuum of not necessarily knowing where you want to go, but so there's. Then a second option is to limit the exemption for energy facilities to those below 2,500 feet, and that I cross-referenced that into the ridgeline discussion because it seemed like that made sense there, and it's on page 42, which is a discussion of ridgelines, and that ridgelines are important, and saying why, that wind energy facilities has presented a policy conflict for Vermont, because on the one hand, they can advance reducing greenhouse gases, but at the same time, they have other impacts that are referenced there. And that you've considered the option of requiring energy facilities that are above 2,500 feet to obtain an Act 50 permit instead of citing approval from the PUC. It doesn't actually say that you're recommending it in either place, because you considered it. I'm also flagging a totally separate point related to ridgelines that no one's raised this, but it seems like with the forest issue, you could also be thinking about whether the 2,500 foot elevation is the right elevation, whether it should be lower, but that's a separate point. That's what I've written in here on energy, and then in the draft bill, there's a couple of options about amending the exemption. You could say the exemption doesn't. Whatever you have in the draft bill will flow from your decision, but on page. Where is it? Page 5 of the draft bill, there's a couple options for energy facilities. Option 1 is what's exempt is what's below 2,500 feet for electric generation. And option 2 is what's exempt is things that are other than merchant generation. Merchant generation being defined as not having majority utility control. And this language isn't magic, but these are the options that I've been able to develop.
I can't find my copy of it. Sure, thanks. No, I had one.
So the 2,500 feet option obviously is primarily affects wind. The merchant generation affects all types of resources, and much of the distributed generation that's being constructed has been non-utilities. As Annette points out, utilities are getting more into the business, I guess you could say. There's also, of course, the option of not doing anything.
I'm sorry. Option 2 is to construction of.
These are, remember, these are exemptions.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to wrap
So
my
what-
head around, so, yes, go.
So option 2 limits the exemption to things that aren't merchant generation. And
So
that's
what
defined,
happens to things that are merchant generation?
if they would be construction for a commercial or industrial purpose, and if they have the requisite acreage, they'd be in Act 250. In a 10-acre town, if they have less than 10 acres, they'd be subject to local zoning.
Whereas now the whole thing is just under the PUC.
As long as it's interconnected to the grid, yes. Almost nearly all of them are.
I guess you have to back it out and say, why are we looking at these? What's the problem we're trying to solve? And I think if it's weighing the environmental impacts of them, why would we treat one differently than another?
I mean, that's a logical argument. There is a possible rationale for saying, okay, if it's a utility project, there's also the issues of making sure that it makes sense economically, and that 248 was originally a lever to prevent utilities from building stuff that doesn't need to be built. They would still have other levers through their rate regulation.
There's a lot we still haven't touched on. So,
There's the whole issue of fragmentation in terms of putting these things into the woods or on the ridge lines. I don't know anything that fragments a wood or forest more than an impervious surface of 8 to 10 miles with platforms that shed water. What kind of impact does that have on, I mean, that, and PUC doesn't usually take those things up, or hasn't.
right, that's why we're talking.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're just putting it forth as an argument as to, fragmentation is, we haven't kicked that around, as a reason why it should come under Act 250, in the site.
Well,
Yeah.
that is the argument, but Act 250 doesn't have a way of measuring the societal benefits of something against the criteria. That's where I just don't understand if it begins to fit. Right?
We could buy the Rex rather than send them out. Rather than
Well, now you're talking about strategies, but if you're talking about a process, you have to have a process that could ever come up to something that isn't just no. Otherwise, it's not a process. You should just prohibit development.
Well, the policies with climate change, is it not? In terms of the understanding of the carbon going into the atmosphere and trying to kind of hold that down. Getting rid of fossil fuels as far as generating electricity. And if we kind of if we buy the RECs instead of exporting them, and I don't know how many of the RECs will get power.
Now we're digressing way
Well,
off.
Yeah,
Our charge is big enough. And
all right.
we don't need to add to it. Aaron.
These are options that we're trying to be responsive to the charge about the exemptions and the ridge lines. But there are other possible ways to do this. I mean, if you decided you wanted all electric generation facilities to go through Act 250, you could add another definition to definition of development that says that. There are probably other ways to do this as well. I think the question for you is how do you want to handle the land use review of these facilities?
Right.
That's the question.
I guess I'm finding that there is a compelling need for us to handle the land use implications of distributed energy in a better way. I don't think we've done a good job.
On the comment about Act 250 taking into account other than environmental issues, the frequent presence of the word unduly in Act 250, I think implicitly expresses an acceptance of some environmental degradation, usually in the interest of economic development, but it could also be So that certain things are gonna be ugly. The idea is that you shouldn't be any uglier than they have to be. That's sort of all I'm doing. And it won't do this or that any more than is necessary. It can be taken that way. It's not naturally what it does.
It just is, I mean, it's the same, to me, a similar misfit. I concede that the PUC and land use is not a natural pairing, and it probably, if you're looking only at land use, has not been very successful. Similarly, asking our district commissions to figure out if electric generation is an undue burden. Now we're gonna ask them to be schooled in electric generation and grid maintenance and, you know, I mean, they just both seem awkward. Really, each flawed.
Aaron and then John.
I don't know if this is, well, I hope it's going to be helpful. I don't, I advocated in front of the PUC on behalf of the Department of Public Service for years. I also was counsel advocate for years. I'm not, I think that there are definitely issues with the PUC's consideration of land use, but they're not always, they weren't always, like, they often did a good job. They don't always, but I had one case in which, on an issue of scenic beauty and aesthetics, they required, they said, wait a minute, you have, to the applicant, you have an alternative place where you could put this, a net metering wind facility on your property that would meet most of your needs and would remove the aesthetic impacts, so we're turning it down. And the issue of alternative locations is something that precedent of the environmental board said, no, we don't make you look at alternative locations. So they, in that particular case, they actually did something that was more protective of aesthetics and scenic beauty. Similarly, they have some general authority to look at forests and other environmental issues that, where in some cases they actually do go further than Act 250 would be able to go. And in other cases, I understand they don't go where people want them to go, and they may not go as far as Act 250 would go. But I think it's a much more mixed bag.
Thank you. John?
I think what Elizabeth Courtney was trying to get at with regard to the waste facility panel was the merging of personnel from two boards, the Water Resources Board and the Environmental Board, on issues involving waste management facilities, landfills, etc. And my understanding of the suggestion was that you could have the three PUC commissioners sit on this merchant energy panel, and that on those kinds of projects, those three commissioners or their delegated staff, hearing officer staff, could sit on that panel, and you could take three from the newly formed 5-member, whatever you call it, environmental board, and they would preside over energy projects. And then all the interests and all the expertise is merged into one panel, reviewing panel, and it would be one decision and one tribunal. And it's been done before successfully. This is not difficult. And I think we're wringing our hands about stuff, so many things that are so simple. That's my 2 cents.
All right, commissioners, we need to move on to other stuff.
What are we gonna do with this? We're just gonna move on.
No?
We're on a dilemma here.
What do you want to do with it?
I don't know.
That's the dilemma.
If I knew, I'd pontificate and tell you. No, it's a nightmare because there really is no good decision, I think. There's nothing that is not horrible. No, on this one, there's nothing that's not horrible.
Wow. Horrible is kind of a tough word.
Well, saying no to clean energy under the circumstances is horrible. And ripping up the ridge lines is horrible.
So if I may add one other sort of piece that seems to have gotten lost a little, and that is the ability of the public to participate. And just from a functional perspective, everyone who is intervening in an energy case right now has to come to Montpelier for a hearing. Even where to park is a nightmare. And you're generally there all day. And there's no accommodation for the public. People are having to come from all over the state. Trying to find a way to utilize the infrastructure that we have within Act 250 is an efficiency thing that also makes the process more accessible to the public. And there are very few cases that the public actually participates in at the Public Utility Commission because of all the barriers. And this is true for our towns too. And that's again getting back to the cost issues that are real in both Act 250 and the PUC. So you're maintaining the status quo is, I don't believe, a good option, because there's a lot of frustration and the public is just feeling shut out. And so I'm trying to add that voice to what I'm not hearing discussed.
Diane?
I just wanted to add something you might not have considered, which is for many years the legislature has been talking about an energy plan and renewable energy, and we're not talking about the future as if there is a plan or a map for where we want the energy. And imagine if we had that the choices you're discussing and have been discussing would be very different. In other words, if there was a plan and you knew where different energy types could be, should be, according to what the municipalities and the regions want, then you're not trying to make the distinction along with land use. It's just a thought.
Peter?
That was the Act 174.
Yeah.
So the Act 174 required regions and authorized towns to do enhanced energy planning to do that exact thing.
Okay.
Oh, see it?
Encouraged.
Sort of.
Doesn't require
Oh, I thought that's what they
I mean,
Either way up.
yes,
The
yeah.
utilities are telling us where we want the power. So that makes it.
Can,
We can just recommend that there's, we have no recommendation. You actually said something earlier, but it's really quick.
We're not ready to recommend a change?
Yeah, we're not ready to recommend a change.
How about the horrible option?
all sides are horrible.
I can't do the horrible option. Can't be part of that.
Not a horrible option.
So there was recently local and regional plans around energy siting. That was out of some bill a few years ago, right? Karen, are you familiar with those details? I remember.
Act 174 created the option for enhanced energy planning, and the result, when you know, the DPS approves regional plans meeting a bunch of standards, and if they do, they get more weight in front of the PUC, and then the regions can approve an enhanced energy plan by their member towns, each member town, or one of, you know, however many want to do it, and that also will get increased weight. And then there was also an initiative by the PUC to try to increase citizen access to its process. I can't really report on the details of that, but there have been some attempts at addressing issues relating to planning and the energy process, the weight given plans, and citizen access in recent years.
And so if a developer is proposing a plan, development, an energy development that comports with a local plan, and they bring it to the PUC, how does the land use element intersect there?
Well, the PUC is required to look at the, we give substantial deference to the plan of the municipality in that type of proceeding. So that would, what I was really wanting to get to was there's a criterion called the orderly development criterion, which is what the PUC looks at instead of the criterion 10, which is conformance with local and regional plan. And this would help if the developer met local plan, this helps the developer meet that criteria. Conversely, if the development doesn't meet the local plan, then the PUC is supposed to give substantial deference, and if they make it harder for the developer to meet the criteria, but not impossible.
Okay. Do you guys have, we made a recommendation on appeals, right?
You've said that you're not ready to recommend it.
Right, we're not ready to recommend recommendation.
This
Yeah.
is,
Okay.
I mean,
We
I don't know whether we really have a bunch to write, but that you've heard conflicting testimony and you believe it's a significant issue, but you're not ready to recommend recommendation.
We did it last.
I looked at that, and you were, came back, you were talking about energy.
Right. So what we're trying to do though is at least get through the charge, and then there's been other things we've been asked to consider that weren't part of our charge or that are not, I don't think we've talked about the V-Trans request, for example, have we done that under exemptions? No.
You haven't.
So we haven't
Your
done-
charge does allow you to look at any other issue relative to Act 250 that you, well, any other issue that you think is relevant.
We are, so, at any rate, the next thing on the list here is de novo on the record, which we have no recommendations.
Right, that relates to appeals, right?
Well, it's an aspect of appeals, but, we've been asked to consider, I think, going on the record.
Yeah.
Right now, it's de novo.
Well, that's another perennial suggestion.
It is a perennial suggestion, and I guess for me, on this one, I would probably not recommend a change. I don't know how the rest of you feel.
I would not recommend it.
Okay, so,
Great.
Yeah. I just want to point out to the commission that I think that it's hard to look at this question in isolation from the others that you've been considering, including whether or not to go back to some type of professional board, which I think if the commission decides to make a recommendation that we do go back to a professional board to look at appeals, that decision will likely have some impact on whether or not you recommend change with respect to de novo or on the record appeals and where they might go.
yeah.
So I think the commission does need to look at those questions collectively.
I don't think that changes we're not ready to do anything, we're not ready to make a change now. Thank you.
I guess I heard what Greg said, and that may be how you want to approach it. I thought there might be a difference between we're not ready to recommend a change on who hears the appeals, and we don't recommend a change on the standard of review for appeals. So maybe
That's true, that's what we just said.
there is a difference, I think. I think you're saying don't go to on the record, or maybe I'm misunderstanding. As opposed to we're not ready to, as opposed to we're not ready to recommend a change.
I get what he's saying.
Right, leave it de novo, either way, is what you're saying.
Well, I'm
No, we're
asking if
saying
that's
we're
what you want to do.
affirmatively deciding
I know,
to leave
yeah.
it at de novo, whereas we are just not quite ready to say.
It's the difference between remaining silent and saying no.
Yeah.
I'm prepared to say no. Not
de
based
novo.
on, to be honest, not based on things this committee has done, but just, they say it's a perennial issue. And over the years, I've heard the same evidence and found the evidence to the contrary non-evidentiary. And it's just, I'm convinced that an on the record would create more problems than it would solve.
Are you ready for that, the
Yes.
recommendation?
Yes.
Yeah.
Paul? Okay, that's our recommendation. Comparison of the history and structure of former E-Board appeals with the current E-Division or Superior Court. I think we've covered that with the data and the stuff that we've done.
You have a whole narrative that tries to do
Compares
that
it.
for you.
Yes, I
But
know.
it doesn't come to a conclusion as to which one, what to do.
Did you look at the access for citizens in that case?
in the review, in the comparison.
I seem to recall Ed Stanek doing some evaluation that there was, that it going to eCourt had reduced citizen participation.
So, you said,
I recall that Ed Stanek had evaluated some data that showed that the move to eCourt had resulted in reduced citizen participation. So I was wondering if that was part of what you were looking at in this
It's
section.
not in here, I don't recall that data. The way citizen participation in this draft is discussed really at the district commission, in the district commission discussion. And there isn't a comparison of citizen access to the former E-board versus citizen access to the environmental division. I'm not exactly sure what that would look like, but if there's data, then that would help.
So that you're remembering testimony from Ed Stanek.
I remember Ed saying it, but I think he was going to be here today, but I guess he's not.
Can we look, he did testify, I
Yeah.
remember that.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, we'll look, see if we can find that.
See what he submitted.
and then do you guys, we talked about the data that, and the averages and the challenges of coming up with meaningful comparisons. Do you feel like we need to talk about that more?
Well, I guess the question is, do you want us to take the data that Jerry supplied and do averages for the appeals and averages, sorry, the permit application appeals, and separately the jurisdictional appeals, and perhaps leave out of those the consolidated cases, because those wouldn't be directly comparable to the former environmental
I think
board.
that's what we suggested earlier, yeah, on this.
We talked about
I think we can do that,
Okay, that
since we're ace number crunchers,
Yeah, that's what we'd like you to do that.
because we have Excel.
All right. Ernie,
I was just wanted to check, I know, I understand on the record and de novo, but there was another recommendation about changing the burden of proof. Is that on your docket or review or discussion?
that's one of yours? Is it in your, I put yours out, thank you for reminding me. Ernie submitted at the last meeting for kind of bigger, which one does it come up in?
It was my recommendation, 3.
Respecting local control in the appeals process.
Yeah.
Require an appellate to have the burden of proving to the Superior Court's Environmental Division that the Act 250 permit should not have been issued or should be modified. Currently, the applicant or permittee has the burden to demonstrate that the Act 250 permit already issued by the District Commission should also be issued by the Environmental Division.
That goes with de novo.
What's that?
That goes with de novo.
An appellant should not be able to take a passive role and cause the applicant undue delay simply by appealing a permit. Instead, they should be required to take an active role and demonstrate the merits of their appeal prior to requiring the applicant to invest substantial time and money, essentially to go through the Act 250 process again on appeal. We ended up talking about this a fair amount last meeting, under how this related already to different criteria, as I recall, right?
We talked a lot about burden of proof at the last meeting.
Yeah,
But
Okay.
not specifically with respect to appeal, but in general.
yeah. Ernie?
Well, I mean, our position, business community, has always been the respect, but I know the de novo issue, and I know the on the record, I've lost that enough times, so I'm not pushing that one anymore. But what I am submitting, and I know it's been an uphill battle, but I will tell you. So, somebody that's worked really hard and diligently and fairly with all the commissions, Conservation Board, A&R, cities, the towns, you name it, and Act 250 for years. So we then have received approval. We're done, right? We get appealed, I understand the appeal process. But the fact that we have to go in, there's two parts. We really would like somebody that's going to appeal to be actively pursuing they can get on the record by just saying, we don't like your parking. They have to actively engage in what it is they're going to appeal. And then our argument is, even if we paid a partial fee, I've been in situations where a neighbor, and I know people use this combatively, and I know we've had this discussion. I had a neighbor of business hold me back for 2 years, and I had to provide 12 expert witnesses, and he had to provide none. So I'm a big believer, I'm putting it back out there, that after a developer who's worked really hard and spent small fortunes, has received all the approvals from all the state agencies, all the local agencies, all the regional components, why should we have to prove that we're right? That's all I'm saying. We should be proven that we're wrong, not that we're right. By the definition that we have to prove we're right, we have to go back through an entire de novo, starting from scratch, and they've attacked us on multiple fronts by just checking off a box. Parking, height, setback, zoning, preservation, stormwater, whatever. They have to bring in no witnesses, I have to bring in all witnesses. And then after that's done, I go to the Supreme Court. So anyway, putting it back out there, I believe burden of proof on somebody that has spent years and gotten all their permits is not the right place. The burden of proof should be on person appeal.
Without taking a position on that, just remember the appeal is just on the criteria that are appealed. It's not the whole case necessarily. The appellant identifies the criteria, usually it's 1, 2, 3 criteria.
Aaron?
Unfortunately, I think I have to get a little bit lawyerly, but, you know, last time you heard that there's, the burden of proof actually has the components of burden of production and the burden of persuasion. And I think if you're gonna go with this route, you might need to really actually look at that, because on the one hand, I hear Ernie saying, I shouldn't have the burden of persuasion. I shouldn't have to show that I was right. They should have to show that it was wrong. But you're also saying I shouldn't have to put on witnesses. And that gets to the burden of production. And I understand why it's expensive, but I also think you have to think about, well, someone has to get in front of the court the basic facts about the development. And if the developer has no burden at all, then, I mean, the developer's the one who knows the basic facts of the development, so you might need at least to put on some testimony to do that. And I'm not necessarily disagreeing with the notion of changing the burden of proof, but if you have a de novo hearing, the court's hearing the evidence over again on the issues under appeal, and someone has to say, okay, well, the project consists of a 3,000 square foot building to do this, that, and that, you know. I'm just, so actually making this work requires some attention to the
Does the district commission come and present or anything? Do they play any role?
No. No, I mean, the court will have the district commission's decision, which will state what it says, but the court is not supposed to assume that the facts as stated in the district commission are correct. It's de novo.
Go ahead, Ernie.
Aaron, real time. I mean, I respectfully say that in real application, so if the burden of proof is on me, I have to get all my ducks in order and spend whatever time to prove that I'm right. The opponent, if they're just looking to delay me, do not have to get any expert witnesses and can waste a lot of time. On the other hand, with what you said, I disagree. If I'm going in and they're presenting a case that I'm wrong, okay, then I'm not right, I have to defend it. I have to bring in my expert witnesses. But I'm just saying, I want an even playing field. There's no, if I don't defend myself adamantly, I don't win, I could lose. I'm going to be as strong as I can, but I want the person attacking me to prove that I'm wrong, not that I have to prove I'm right.
is this not a perennial?
I don't think burden of proof has come up a lot over the years. We have some people here who have acted as opponents. Would anyone like to rebut what we just heard?
Well, I don't like litigation, and that's why I want to see people try and work together up front. The whole concept of litigation, I mean, it sounds like he has a business that's a neighbor that has some deep pockets. That's not always the case, though. So while that may be, it's hard to speak in generalities, while that may be his experience in a business-oriented community, for many citizens who don't have resources but feel that the permit was issued in error, to try and to shift that burden would be a tremendous burden unless there was intervenor funding, because then the burden would be on them. And as Jerry said, you can do a lot with cross-examination. And so if you're now requiring that anybody who files an appeal has to put on a full case with all their experts, that's a big change. And it would be an impediment, a further impediment to citizen participation. And I'll just add that I'm seeing kind of a conflict here in Vermont and in these discussions about the urban areas compared to the rural areas. I think that there's two different sides now. There's two different parts of Vermont, and a lot of the things that go on in the more urban areas are very different from what we see in the rural areas. Just throw that out there.
Jamie.
I mean, one thing that hasn't been mentioned today, and I think it would be important in any kind of process, right now, the current on appeal, most parties are funneled into some kind of mediation. And that's where there's an opportunity before you even get to where the burden lies. I mean, in a de novo proceeding, as we've already talked about, it depends on the criteria who's ultimately has the burden of persuasion. I agree with Aaron. I mean, the applicant has to have the burden of production to just say what their project is and how it complies with the criteria. And I imagine for Ernie and for other applicants that are on the development side, they're more or less using the basis of the materials from either permits that they've already received, or at least at Act 250. They first have to, if it's on appeal, they're gonna use the materials that they had. So it does get to the burden of persuasion, and if in a situation we've been in, and there's no way, if we don't agree in mediation, and mediation is usually successful in a lot of cases, we're going to have to go in and put in some evidence to actually persuade the court as to why, as an appellant, the criteria was not met. And so I think the bottom line is, at the end of the day, the party's going to have to put on a necessary amount of evidence to prevail anyway. And so I don't know what good it really does a party unless they just have deep pockets and they're just running out the clock and trying to delay and delay and delay. Maybe that's the case that Ernie's had. I guess we just don't have that experience because that's not the way that we are involved in the system.
Oh, Ernie. Yeah.
Last comment, because Annette, I've heard what you said. Just so everybody understands, I started when Act 250 started in 1970. So I've been doing this a long time. I have never lost an Act 250. I've quit. I've stopped, and it's taken me a ridiculous amount of years to get where I want, and I've never lost an appeal. So I just want to put that out there. And Annette, I do what you talk about. I spend 90% of my time meeting the needs of neighbors and the like. But in answer, what I really get up in arms, and that's what my argument is here, is unlike people with a really good philosophical basis that want to continue this, I've been dragged through the mud by people that just want to hold me up for 2 years. I spend tens of thousands of dollars and they spend 500. That's where my burden of proof lies. That's been my experience.
I think going through a permitting for 50 years, you're going to have bad stories. I mean, permitting's difficult. It's because you're dealing with humans and money and property rights and all sorts of things. But to answer, I think it was Dick's question, how would you respond? I guess the issue is, in terms of presenting the case to the court, I don't know if a neighbor would be able to put the full context together for the court to understand. They present what their problem was in the court, or the board or the commission would be saying, I don't understand it. What's the context? And the only person that can really put it in context, I think, is the applicant. The applicant's already there, and that would be the reason. Put it in context, put your case on, and then the other side has to tell them what's wrong. Otherwise, the record's going to be just this dangling, whatever it is, that they have a problem with the left turn, you know, or they have a problem with the apex on the building and the aesthetics. But you have to put it all in context, and the only one with the full ability to do that is the applicant, I think, under a de novo.
So Ernie, how often has this come up for you?
I'm sorry?
How often have you had this happen?
Not that many.
No.
3-4 times over that period of time. And like, I work really hard. I don't use Annette's model, but her philosophy, I do, absolutely. It's a lot easier to work through the process and get it done than to go to court. Where I have been to court has been generally people that are out just to stop me.
Or slow you. I mean, this relates to the misuse of appeals as well.
I think it's where we are.
It came in with Senate Natural Resource Loop. And the frustration expressed, and it was only anecdotal, was somebody files a, well, it could even be party status too, I think, as we were talking about it. But basically, they have a complaint that is designed to give them, you know, to meet one of the criteria, but their complaint is actually, you're my competitor and I don't really want you doing business anywhere. But you make it about the left turn, and then the businesses come together outside of the process and figure some settlement out, and now the complaint gets withdrawn. Well, the left turn is still a problem, but no one's appealing, no one's highlighting that anymore, and so to the extent it was just used, you know, and if we're going to say that the state interest is to have smooth left turns, and no one now is there arguing about the left turn because somebody had a settlement out of the process, that's not really very healthy. Nobody suggested this was happening all the time by any stretch, but that sort of dynamic is abuse of the process and stuff like that.
Aaron?
So, if you're onto this issue, I'd point out on page 63 what we were able to put together, which is more general law stuff than any facts, because I don't know of any facts about whether, you know, I know people say that it's happened, but
Right.
So, to get party status, you're supposed to demonstrate a particularized interest. And if you're unable to demonstrate that interest, party status can be denied, and then also at the close of a proceeding, the person's party status is re-examined and the person might be disqualified. So those are existing mechanisms that could have an effect on the extent to which someone can abuse the opportunity to participate in an appeal. Whether they are having the desired that effect, I can't tell you. Then to appeal, you have to have party status and be aggrieved by the decision, which means it has to harm your particularized interest in some way. And you're limited to appealing what you got party status on. Of course, you can actually appeal being turned down on party status or something. So, but those are also, that's a limit to your ability to appeal. And finally, there are sanctions available if you file something for an improper purpose. I can't say that I ever saw sanctions imposed in the years that I litigated, but sanctions will exist. I actually don't remember any motions in any cases I was involved in for sanctions.
Yeah, I think-
So, so those are the mechanisms that exist today that may militate against or have some protection against this. Whether they're sufficient, I don't know.
Ernie, have you had experience? It looked like you might have had experience with the,
Try to get a bond against somebody that's appealing is virtually impossible. It's there legally, but it's perceived as abandoning their rights to appeal you, and it becomes really complicated. I walked that walk once, and I wouldn't walk it again.
You mentioned the term the bond, and it is possible for, I think, to ask for a bond. I was talking about sanctions, which is something a little different. It's if you file a document for an improper purpose. In other words, you're filing the appeal in order to delay. You're
But
not-
Aaron, I think
I'm not disagreeing with you about the bond, and I'm not saying that this happens all the time.
No, but I'm just saying, to fight somebody's integrity, it gets back into, party status, who has rights, who doesn't. I've never gone there because I don't ever felt it was a winnable cause. Because somebody would always come up with a story that they have the right to do that and it's very legitimate. And as you said, the left turn is really important.
Well, this is reminiscent of the committee discussion,
Yes,
that's why we
that's why you said it
pushed
down
it
the
into
road
the,
to this.
so I'm not sure we'll be able to come up with anything, better than this outline that Aaron's just highlighting.
Except we have to have a recommendation,
Well,
so.
maybe there would be a way to just collect data on how many appeals seem to be.
Does this go to the same issue you hear people talk about, that, one person who drives by is, getting party status and holding things up, and I like the idea of actually getting some facts on that, because this one person can drive everyone nuts for years. I hear that over and over and over as a real detriment to Act 250. And in fact, I live in an area with a lot of development and new development proposed, and I actually would like to intervene on some of those things, but I just drive by, I see traffic accidents. So I don't even know that it's real anymore, if it ever was.
But maybe the recommendation could be, because we just have heard anecdotes, but maybe there would be some clever way of quantifying it.
Yes, that was a question I was about to ask, which is how would you get the data? Because one person's frivolous argument is another person's good faith.
I mean, in the case where you're where somebody asserts the left-hand turn problem and then leaves the situation mysteriously, and the left-hand turn problem is not addressed at all, I don't know how you do it.
There's no record of that.
No, okay. I don't know.
Are you saying, Chris, it hasn't happened, or that?
We
would
hear about it happening, but
There's
it's
no-
off the books, so you don't know the facts. You never will.
It's a problem, though, in the sense that, the parties allege things and then they settle. Others don't intervene allegedly because they're addressing the issues, and the settlement happens. So you have these kind of anomalies and issues that are out there. I don't know if they can ever be proved.
How many have you experienced that you would guesstimate?
Well, anytime you have a settlement, it raises that specter, I suppose. And you don't know who didn't appeal also or participate necessarily. It's not like a big group of hundreds joined. Just some neighbors and everybody, some other people say, okay, we're going to Florida, we're not going to spend our time. And then there's a settlement, you come back and you find out. So those are just issues. I don't know if you can legislate.
And the tribunal, even at the district level, has the option of pursuing the issue, even if the person who brought it
Correct.
has dropped out. I remember when I was chairing district commission, we had the owner of a particularly ugly business oppose an application from a competitor on aesthetic grounds. And it did not stand a straight face. But I ended up agreeing with them that the project was aesthetic, more of an aesthetic intrusion than it needed to be, and the rest of my commission outvoted me, but I voted against it. I mean, even though the person objecting had already gone away. You have the option. I was upheld on appeal, by
You got good taste. We identified the
On the
Costco
record?
appeals in our filing, and it took almost 3 years, because there were 12 separate appeals by 2 gas stations against Costco, because Costco wanted to put in pumps. And you know, it went the distance.
So I guess I just want to make sure I understand Ernie's proposal, which would really be that someone making an appeal would have to come in and say, this is why the district commission decision was wrong. And that's a bad idea because of the cost of it? I mean, I guess I'm not understanding the...
Today, when the appellant files an appeal, they do have to file within 3 weeks a statement of issues. And they will have to argue why the district commission was wrong, but I think that the question that Ernie's raising is, they're the ones who have the risk. In other words, the risk should be on them, not the applicant, and then also
How would you put the
the
risk on?
applicant. The applicant shouldn't have to be the only one presenting testimony. How would you put the risk on them? You could specify that the burden of persuasion is on the appellant. I think this is why so there's 2 components to this. There's the risk of non-persuasion, if you will. There's who's got the job to persuade the judge, and then there's who has the job to put on evidence that at least is the basic evidence about the project, enough for the judge to make a decision.
I guess I haven't done this, but don't they both do that, which is what we were just talking about? Functionally, don't they, both sides have to sort of defend their case?
You have to make a case. You can make it through cross-examination. So this is what, I mean, you can have a de novo appeal where the applicant has to put on, I don't know, say it's on traffic, or whatever, but the applicant puts on a witness about traffic, and then the opponent tries to make the case through cross-examining the applicant's witness. And I think that's something Ernie has a problem with, if I'm not mistaken.
Ernie's trying to say that the appellant should make the case that Ernie failed.
I get that, and Evan.
So an imperfect but perhaps helpful visual aid is, many of the lawyers in the room probably heard this at some point in time, but take a quarter and put it on its edge, right? And imagine that the way that a case is going to resolve depends upon which way that quarter falls, right? And both parties come in and they do their very best and they present all of their evidence. But at the end of the day, that quarter is still on its edge. In other words, the evidence didn't support pushing it one way or another. The outcome of that case then hinges on who has the burden of persuasion. Because if the person has the burden of persuasion and they didn't make that quarter fall, they lose. So that's why the burden of persuasion really matters, even if everyone comes to court and presents all of their evidence and puts on the best case possible. That's why it's important.
Great, that's great. Thank you, that helps me.
It doesn't help me in the slightest. Although it's a good illustration. When the quarter doesn't fall over, then the permit stands, right? Because there's no appeal.
If the challenger has the burden of proof.
That's what Ernie's asking for.
If the challenger has the burden of proof and they can't make the quarter fall, the permit stands and they lose. If the permittee has the burden and they don't make the quarter fall, then they lose because they didn't carry their burden.
That's the complaint. That doesn't make sense.
That's
Why
how it
wouldn't
is
it
now.
sort of resort back to the district commission's decision? If
Because
the appeal fails, they haven't made the case that the permit was in error, Then why wouldn't the permit stand?
Because right now, the person challenging the permit doesn't have the burden of persuasion.
That's what Ernie's asking for.
Yeah, the permittee has the burden of proving that they deserve the permit all over again.
Does the board support the status quo?
Well, I don't know whether or not it's had sufficient time to take a look at Ernie's proposal and make a recommendation one way or another. I know that's not helpful, but that's the response I have to give.
What you're talking about is if you're having a dueling of equals.
Right.
Okay, watch this, real time. You want to stop me. You hire an attorney, does 6 different things. This is preservation, blah, blah, wrong. Landscaping, blah, blah, wrong. Subdivision, blah, blah, and you name it, you got it, done. They file. I go in. So now you get up and you spend 1 minute saying, we testify that my landscaping is wrong, right? It's up to me to prove that my landscaping is right.
Right.
So I have to get an expert witness up for an hour to prove to the judge everything that I did and was already approved on is correct. Next, traffic. Don't like your traffic, left-hand turn screwed up. I have to get my traffic engineers apply to the court to show the judge that every aspect of my traffic report is correct. You have done nothing. Nothing. You don't have to do anything because the burden of proof is not on you. It's on me. And I have spent 2 years, 3 years of my life getting 40 different letters and permits to prove them again. So my argument was that local control is being usurped in that aspect. So I say I've spent the time and the energy to get all of my permits. If somebody's going to appeal me, prove that the Conservation Board, ANR, whatever you're appealing me on, is wrong. I've already proved that I'm right, or I wouldn't have gotten the permit.
Well, and if you were denied and you were appealing, you'd have the burden of proof in what you're asking.
That is absolutely correct.
Yeah, okay. And that,
Well, that is interesting.
I just wonder if this might effectively create a rebuttable presumption. In other words, would the court view it, if you change the burden of proof, would then people who, I mean, we're assuming that these appellants don't have a legitimate case, but maybe they do.
maybe they do.
Yeah.
And yet they would be walking in the door perhaps disadvantaged already if this, whether it was the intent or not, whether it was perceived as a presumption.
That's burden of proof,
John? Oh. What? Oh. Aaron?
I guess what I wanted to point out was that if the burden of proof is on the appellant, I think the issue that I was trying to point out earlier, and the issue that Jerry mentioned, is just who makes sure that the court understands what the project is.
But the developer
And the
has a lot
applicant,
of
well,
motivation.
so the applicant, in the case where the burden of proof is on the appellant and the appellant is not the applicant, it is possible for an applicant to just say, hey, you got the burden of proof, I don't have to do anything. I'm just gonna pick apart your case. And maybe that's right, but I think that the court may need to know something about the context. I'm sorry if I'm hurting your head, I don't mean.
I didn't say you were. I didn't say you were. I said this.
But it's not, I'm not trying to say that the applicant should put all the applicant's experts all over again. I'm saying that somehow the court in a de novo appeal is gonna need the basics of the context.
Because what'll happen is the neighbor will come in, start characterizing the project, and the applicant will say, objection, I never asked that, I didn't ask that, that's not what and if they don't have the plans fully, or the models, or all the traffic data, or whatever it is, then it's gonna be hard, it's gonna be difficult, it'll be difficult. I think what happened was whenever they made this decision, they understood that the only one that has the information, full information, is the applicant. And if they're at the appeal level, the applicant should put it on, and then the other side should show its case.
Well, is there a way to do both?
Well,
I
I
think
mean,
we
that's
could
what
write
you're-
something that does both, yes.
Yeah.
Like the applicant.
The applicant does it now, and then the other side comes in, and Ernie's saying, well, maybe it should be the other way. And I'm just saying that I think what'll happen is the neighbor won't have the file, won't have the complete case to show why he or she should win. And it'll be difficult.
So what if the developer, let's just say, Ernie has the burden of production, like presenting, and then the burden of persuasion was the appellant?
That's a different, that's so kind of.
I'm no lawyer, but could that work? I'm not in the room.
All the lawyers are going like this.
We're still with you though, we're still with you.
Where's my quarter? I want that.
Yeah. Take my quarter. Start the
You
weekend.
could have something where you say the burden of proof is on the appellant, but the applicant shall have a burden to produce the basic facts of the development and its impacts under the criteria under appeal.
Let's try
That's
that.
fine,
Try that on persona. I always choose both when I can.
Does the regional commission have, give an explanation as to why they approved any given project?
That's what I asked. The regional commission never comes to testify to back up their work in an appeal?
I don't know.
Is it not really?
Well, I mean,
Oh, district commission.
District commission.
Oh, the district commission.
Yeah, yeah.
No, that'd be like
De
the trial judge doesn't go to the Supreme Court and say, this is why I made a decision. You read the decision.
Oh, I know you did that.
Did they used to?
When it's de novo, does the judge read the decision?
The judge may read the decision, but
Thanks.
it has
Yeah.
much
And
less.
two more
technical
weight.
weight.
They can't cite it. I'm sure they read it.
I'm sure they read it. Okay. All right.
all right, that was easy.
A couple more easy ones last Friday afternoon. The commission's pleasure. We
You
have,
want to do your,
yeah, so I was gonna ask if you wanna do them. I think there's a few other items we haven't done in the draft report, but there were also sort of special requests that came in from the administration on transportation projects being exempt.
because they had to go through all the federal permitting and blah, blah, blah.
That's the case they tried to make, yes.
Those are different questions. Federal process, there are Act 250 questions, they're only Act 250.
Correct, yeah. I mean, I personally am not inclined to have V-Trans projects be exempt from Act 250. I mean, they actually made the case that they're one of the largest landowners with some of the more complicated projects that we have, and frankly, if someone can tell me what the federal government's gonna be doing next year on environmental protection, I'm all ears. But right now, it doesn't seem the time for us to,
Oh, I think I can tell you.
oh yeah, exactly, right, not much?
Yeah.
Yeah, so,
You're gonna pave the ground.
I guess for me, I don't think it's the time for us to do this.
Quarry it.
So, is that acceptable to the other commissioners present? All right. Chris?
Ag had a request as well. Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I have a list of them here that I was gonna go through.
Yeah, and I guess I'd sort of say a similar thing to what John Groveman said, and just not closing the door, thinking about this evolving issue and keeping the door open, even if we're not ready to affirmatively recommend some of these changes.
Right, so agriculture was looking for us to kind of extend the work we've done this session for local land use review around ag.
Ancillary business stuff, or I
Right.
must have missed it.
Accessory on-farm business.
Accessory on-farm businesses, yeah, I'm not ready to make a recommendation that we do this either right now.
Like turning the barn into a wedding chapel.
Yeah, so,
What's that?
it's, he said turning the barn into a wedding chapel.
Yeah, weddings were not the proposal, but
Yeah.
it is an example, you're right, of a type of accessory use we're seeing, but that wasn't the proposal itself, more about things that had a direct connection to agriculture, on-farm education, events that have a direct nexus to farming. So weddings was not part of the proposal specifically.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm clearing my throat. I could add more, but I'll let Alex speak.
Yeah, I mean, it is an issue that we're seeing on the, looking ahead. There are a lot of businesses that are sort of right on this line right now of whether or not jurisdiction applies. There are some that have sought Act 250 permits and have gone through a process, and maybe it's resulted in beneficial things, but others that have not, other accessory on-farm businesses that have not pursued an Act 250 permit or even jurisdictional opinion. It is one of the ways that we're seeing the working landscape be conserved in Vermont is through accessory businesses. If you look at farms that are succeeding and sort of adapting, many of them do have these type of accessory businesses. So just thinking about that going forward to this is a big part of why our landscape is what it is agriculture and other working lands activities in Vermont.
Aaron?
I wanted to point out that Act 143, what it did was it limited municipal regulation of on-farm businesses. And exemption is not the same as limited regulation. One thing, if you're going to extend, you could consider, you could certainly consider the exemption if you think that that's the right policy. But one of the things that you might want to look at is does the application process have to be the same? This is actually, I guess, going to a broader point, because that the NRB could be like tailoring application process to different kinds of activities. Similar to what other jurisdictions may have differing levels and longer or shorter permitting processes, if you will, or different kinds of review for different types of projects. You can have applications that are specific to on-farm accessory uses or other things. And I just wanted to point out that there might be some process things that could be done that haven't really been gotten into.
That's a reasonable point. Yeah.
I guess when the presentation was made and I asked how many of the actual examples they gave us were subject to jurisdiction, there was only one that was noted, and it was for the building of cabins, which for me, lots of people want to put, there's like, this is a business, farm or not farm, that's happening, and if you're not a farm, you go through whatever required permitting processes you trigger by the size of your development. So I guess I'm not, I don't know, I think it's a little bit like parsing the land use impacts of distributed power projects. If the issue is environmental impacts and land use, I'm not sure we should be separating it again. I think we have a lot of exemptions in Act 250 right now, and I'm not sure they're helping us meet the goals of Act 250.
could we say, I'm colored by a tour I took of a farm that was heavily investing in regenerative ag practices and bringing compacted soils back to health and having mixed use that was having an old dairy that was just beat to hell, and their cafe on site was the only way they were making it that was viable. And so that particular farmer praised our work up and down. So could we just sort of, as we're concluding to do nothing, acknowledge that this is a dynamic area? I mean, it's sort of a, as we're not ready to affirmatively say no kind of thing, just sort of acknowledge that this may be a strategy as we consider farm viability going forward. I don't know if anybody. It's tricky. It's really tricky.
With all the exemptions, the underlying idea is the exempt thing is good.
Yeah.
And
you're right.
Act 250 inconveniences it. I mean, Yeah, good for organic farmers, good for, that's a good thing. They still might wanna answer the questions.
You're right. Okay.
That's how I feel. Still might, I'm sorry, could you?
We still might wanna have them answer the questions as to their environmental impact.
Sure, sure. So I guess, think about something like the Intervale in Burlington that recently went through an Act 250 permit amendment. And, it's a question of, are they more of a net good, even though they may have environmental impacts? Thinking about ways to increase local food, otherwise it's coming from across the country. Thinking about ways to get people learning about the landscape, directly engaging with it. Is that a benefit that we want to foster through changes to Act 250?
We just want them to get the permit.
Yeah.
Sure,
Like other
yeah,
businesses.
right. I mean, they did get the permit, yeah, but the process it took, over 100 days.
People who hate Act 250 and don't want to be under its jurisdiction complain about it, and people like me say to them, yeah, but you're a citizen and grow up and just honor your responsibilities. Unless it's something we really like. And then we say, yeah, right, that is awfully inconvenient and expensive. I think we really have to kind of, if we're going to hold the shopping center developers' feet to the fire, there's no particular reason why the organic farmer doesn't want to have to face that as well.
Okay, the other two that I remember that came in from the administration sort of separate from our charge, MSA, or in addition to, was the forestry proposal. Do we?
That's about forest businesses,
Forest,
loggers.
yeah, businesses.
And actually
it came
forest
in,
products.
so Michael and Sam presented kind of complicated proposal.
Yeah.
Board feed and
Yeah.
minor applications.
Feed and ag soil mitigation, and yeah, it was like, yeah. So what do you guys want to do with that proposal? Aaron, is it in there?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what you're meaning, but their Act 194 added something about forest products processing and permit conditions to your charge.
Right.
Yeah.
That's on page 24. And the charge is reviewing whether permit conditions in 250 permits negatively impact the ability of a forest processing operation to operate in an economically sustainable manner, whether they limit the ability of a forest processing operation to alter production or processing in order to respond to market conditions. And then if you determine that there is a significant economic impact, you recommend alternatives. And we have the information that you got about how many sawmills and Act 250 review summarized on page 24. I think you have testimony that is probably undisputable that Act 250 permit conditions will limit the ability of a forest processing operation to alter production or processing in order to respond to market conditions. I mean, if you have limits on the hours of operation and things like that, you may not be able to operate when you want to respond to market conditions. What I think you don't have is just what is really the quantification of the economic impact.
Well, one of the things I thought we got was that there were like 1 or 2 sawmills with hours of operation limits. I mean, it wasn't many, right?
That may be so.
Yeah, it's right here, 2 of the permits contain conditions.
Yeah.
But that's not the same as what's the universe of negative impacts, is that what you're saying?
Well, this is asking you like, are they actually negatively affecting the ability of the operation to operate in an economically sustainable manner? And if you determine that there's a significant negative economic impact, to recommend alternatives. And I don't think you have the actual economic impact data. And you have some anecdotal testimony and people who have concerns, and you also, I think it's hard to dispute that if there is a limit on hours of operation, you can't always respond to market conditions.
Yeah, I thought what Sam had to say was talking about a little more flexibility, not that would go on to the permit, so that they would have a certain period of time which they could extend their hours of operation either like maybe from January to March, or something before the roads broke off for one thing. Or I think they were asking for the idea that if you're using the idea of noise, and especially in the nighttime, and running skidders and bringing things out of the woods, and preventing that from happening, then that was having an adverse impact on the operation, and that was causing people to not be able to get their wood out in time, and then the roads broke up and they weren't able to do it. So I was under the impression they were asking for some flexibility.
They were asking for 60 days. as I
60
recall.
days,
But
all right.
I guess I'm also back to what's the problem we're trying to solve. 2 had permits related to hours of operation.
Yeah.
Greg?
Yeah, just to clarify, the 2 permits that had conditions related to hours of operation, that was within the last 5 years. So we didn't do a look back with respect to all permits ever issued in the history of Act 250. That was just for the last 5 years. So there very well may be more facilities that had hours of operations conditions.
The problem we're trying to solve is that the lousy wood market is going away.
Right.
Yeah,
That-
right.
So really, we're not able to
So we'll
solve
get
that
on that.
problem, is the problem that I'm saying. We can't fix this problem with Act 250, whatever, flexibility, removal of jurisdiction, or...
But we don't have the data to have a quantifiable analysis, it strikes me. We've heard some stories. To me, we should say that, and say that at this point, we don't recommend a change.
Jamie?
I guess I'll offer this just because I heard some of the testimony last year in House Agriculture and Forestry Committee. I think that the proposal that you have in front of you from the administration is trying to deal with a situation where you maybe have what would be considered a default or just go to hours of operation condition, that maybe then in the end doesn't allow for that flexibility when the wood needs to come in the winter when the conditions are right. And I guess we could see some validity in the training and having some template that in the case of moving wood products, there is a need to be aware of that dynamic. And I agree with their proposal that you would not want to preclude a party that has legitimate issues around the hours of operation, let's say, to be able to then put on the reasoning why there should be some parameters around that. So I think that recommendation you had to have training and a template that works for forest processing was actually helpful. It was one that we had actually supported as an idea in the legislature last year when there were other forest processing ideas that were on the table. And so while you're examining that first part of the proposal, I just wanted to offer you that.
So you're saying you would support, I guess the thing that I'm struck by is like if Act 250 is supposed to be kind of citizen-based and regional in its approach, the district commission could also be flexible in how they apply the restrictions on a business, and that's the whole point.
My understanding is they're just standard conditions that kind of just rolled down and they weren't modified for whatever reason.
That's a different issue,
Yeah,
yeah.
right.
Greg?
Yeah, well, no matter what the project is, ultimately, the commission has to determine whether or not there's an undue adverse impact as a result of the project. And so no matter how much training the commission gets with respect to specific concerns relative to the logging and forestry industry, it still could, their proposed operations could still rise to the level of an undue adverse impact, which would prevent the commission from issuing positive findings with respect to those criteria. And so we think that the answer really is beyond just required training and required templates. If the legislature does see a need to allow for more flexibility with respect to this industry, we think that it needs to be embedded within the law itself and not just as a mechanism, and not just through training and not just through a standard template, which we don't think will resolve the legal issues presented by the problem.
guess, is there anywhere else that we're so prescriptive? Where we would say, oh, you have to give 60 days of any hours of operation on a business? I don't, like,
I mean, some businesses, some industries have complete exemptions, like we talked about the slate quarry industry. But no, I can't think of any situations where we treat one industry differently than others.
Yeah. Lost Tom. I'm hitting that. What do you guys think? We lost Chris.
I would like to see the flexibility go forward. And I'm not so sure I understand what the present change should come within this Act 250 or within the law itself. But I think if we're talking about working landscape, and we're talking about rural Vermont, being such a desperate place now, I think somehow we're restricting the working landscape more than is really necessary.
You could include it in the definition of agriculture. There you go. It's exempt.
Include what?
The right to
Forestry.
Right to forestry.
Evan?
I was just going to say something to add on to what Greg had mentioned, and the reason for a preference for putting it in the statute as opposed to mandating that the board come up with a permit template. You just don't want to end up into a situation where other industries come in and start asking for permit templates that contain mandatory conditions of that nature. That's just one risk.
So you're not supporting that part of the request?
Well, I think what Greg mentioned was if there's going to be a change that comes up related to providing this kind of flexibility, there's several different ways that you can provide that flexibility. You can either do it directly in the statute, or you can mandate that the board come up with a permit template. And I think we're just flagging that if one business sector gets a specialized permit template, our other business sectors going to be asking for the same thing. And is there a different mechanism for effectuating the change that FPR is requesting, assuming the commission thought it was a good change to make?
But you don't like the idea of training the district commissions and having them understand that there's a lot of extenuating circumstances potentially around the forest products industry.
No, there's no objection to additional training on any specific subject matter. More information tends to be good information. Giving them training is a great idea.
But on its own, I don't think that's sufficient.
So what are you guys supporting?
We would agree to some language that would provide some flexibility for the industries, for the forestry industry, provided that it was built into the statute so that the commissions don't have to wrestle with this concept of whether or not it's undue and adverse.
Well, they have to wrestle with it all the time. That's what they do on every other development.
I don't actually understand what the problem is. I mean, permit conditions are specific to those permits. So by definition, there's already flexibility, isn't there?
Yeah.
Well, with respect to the conditions, yeah, I mean, a commission is granted the authority to require that a business operate a certain manner through conditions, and the assumption is that those conditions prevent the operation from being undue and adverse to the environment and to the other criteria. So to disallow commission from including a condition that would regulate the hours of operation, I think would go beyond the current mandate of those commissions.
You basically would be saying, as a matter of law, 60 days of flexibility, or however many days, does not constitute an undue adverse impact, as a matter of law.
And what if there's like 20 houses that I don't understand. There needs to be some context for this sort of review and evaluation. Like, I don't know.
Would it be relative to location?
It should be relative to location.
So we're the district commission, all right? and the neighbors come and they say, this project is ruining our lives, protect us. And they suggest various conditions we put on the permit, and then the applicant comes and says, you do that, you're gonna put me out of business. We've got a problem. We're gonna ponder what are we gonna do, and we have the legal authority to go either way. And we're gonna try to not put someone out of business or let him ruin somebody's life. And we've already got flexibility to try to.
Aaron?
When the statute uses the words undue or unreasonable, then I think the district commissions get to decide what's undue or unreasonable in a particular context. So I'm not aware of any rule or interpretation that says they can't today say that, okay, your hours of operation are, you know, these hours, except for 60 days out of the year, you don't have to do that, because we don't think that's a due. I'm not seing the legal interpretation that prevents them from doing that.
Right, and I guess that's what I would like in the discussion, that we say, there's already flexibility in the existing system, and I'm inclined to not recommend a change.
And to explain why.
Explain why we're not.
The flexibility is already there, so
Yeah.
it's already there. So it's up to the individual regional commission to put conditions. Create flexibility.
Case by case.
Yeah, yeah. I can go.
Would it make sense to hear from the commissioner? I mean, I feel like we're not representing his issue as well as he could.
Well, we've heard from him a couple times, and we're wrapping up. Yeah.
Let's go for it.
Yeah, we have to keep going.
Public comment.
Rural industrial parks. Sorry, the administration process. I don't even, this one was also very complicated to me.
Rural industrial park?
Yeah, this was asking for lower fees and
To me, it's not something to talk about standalone, but we have sort of, I gotta go back and figure out where we landed, but we had talked about the different designations, right? And trying to come up with some principles that we were developing.
well, these would be, I think, industrial parks not in designated centers. That's exactly the point. It would be
Right.
promoting development outside of our designated centers in a manner that
Right.
could be contradictory to a lot of what we've talked about during this process. Aaron, can you remind me if this shows up in our report and where we might find it?
The industrial parks? It is not in the report.
It's in Act 194.
Act 194 directs ACCD to submit a report on this issue to various standing committees of jurisdiction, and requires it to do so in consultation with various entities. One of the entities named is the Commission on 250. So ACCD, by bringing it to you, is attempting to fulfill its duty to consult with you. You don't actually have, you aren't assigned a task.
Okay.
This is certainly, they're talking about Act 250. You have been asked to do something, you have the ability to respond, but you actually aren't assigned a specific task related to industrial parks.
Okay. Does any commissioner want to take up a task as related?
Not this one.
Okay. All right, so those are the ones I remembered that we haven't gone to, but that were brought to us from the administration. There are other holes in here, but I think what we should do is, are there any members of the public who haven't had a chance to speak today, who are just waiting for this moment? Okay, seeing none.
Well, Annette just happens to duck out.
Oh, well, Annette, Annette, we're in the public comment period at the moment.
I would like to speak to something I've been hearing, if you don't mind.
Okay.
And I don't want to advocate for anything, I just want to educate. And that's the topic of climate change and these discussions you've had about the PUC and Act 250. For the record, I'm Annette Smith, Executive Director of the Vermont for a Clean Environment. To explain how the PUC handles greenhouse gas emissions on a solar project. Let's say a solar project has got 20 acres and you're gonna cut a forest. So the developer hires an expert who comes in and shows that the benefits will offset a gas power plant in Massachusetts. And by the logic in that, we should clear cut all our forests and cover our whole state with solar, and that will benefit. And I've never seen any counter to that argument. It's a very narrow argument, and that's the only way that it's looked at. And it's always the developers' experts that do it. A&R takes a look at this, and but I don't feel like it's a very thorough discussion. On the wind issue, I noticed in the report, and also Senator McCormick, you said it, that there is, obviously a greenhouse gas benefit there. And I've been looking for that benefit for a long time. And it's an assumption that people make, but I actually haven't seen evidence of it. I have asked the operator of the largest gas plant, or the most efficient gas plant in New England, it's in Londonderry, New Hampshire, what happens when and it's the ramping plant. The Electric Generation Siting Commission visited it, and I went along. So I asked the CEO and the operator, what happens when your plant ramps down to let the wind in? And he said, then we're running inefficiently. We're burning more gas, think carbon traffic. So until we get an analysis of the New England grid, of how all these things interconnect, we really don't know. We don't have enough information to know anything about whether or not our current renewable energy projects that are being built all over New England are actually having an effect of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because it's a complicated system. And while it's a goal, it's just not that simple. Just don't put up, and what we've done in Vermont, unfortunately, is built a lot of renewables in the wrong place. So right now, in the Northeast Kingdom and this grid-constrained area, there's over 400 megawatts of energy trying to get through in an area that only has an average load of 30 to 65. And this is a big topic of discussion, and so finding out where to build these in the right place in the grid is really important. And what Act 174, I believe in the statute, was supposed to do was to create a collaborative or cooperative discussion with planning commissions and utilities and communities to come up with where we want these things sited, but we don't have as planners enough information to make that decision because the utilities are not participating in this discussion. And so until you know where the utilities say the power is needed, it's developer driven. The developers are choosing the sites, and they may not be. And there's been very good informal discussions with the utilities and pro se parties at the PUC. They're really doing a good job of outreach, and we record all these, so the videos are all available for people who want to watch. And the utilities are now, and this is the municipals, it's the co-ops, and it's Green Mountain Power, are all saying we only want more power in the areas where the grid can support it. And so this is this is complicated, but as we think about our land use, as we think about siting of these intensive land use projects, it's a complicated discussion. It is not straightforward that if we just build more anywhere that's going to make a difference. We have to be more strategic about what we do. We have to be more thoughtful and informed and educated and create more of a process where people do work together so that we are putting the right generation and the right types of generation in the right place.
Thank you. Bruce?
Hi, my name's Bruce Post. I'm as a citizen, and maybe I'm tired. I was standing where she is, and I was going to say something, but I deferred to the person raising their hand in the corner. So I said maybe I've been here too long today. I've heard the term, the purpose of Act 250, and I've got some background in it, but I'm confused. I have no idea what the purpose of Act 250 is anymore. I've heard discussions about, well, this is a horrible option and this is a horrible option, but we're going to pick one of the horrible options. You know, when my mother died many years ago, people went by the casket and they said, oh, she looks so good, but she was dead. Is Act 250 really about, you know, there's a presumption that we're going to continue to destroy ecosystems, but do it in a way that looks good, then all we're doing is destroying the corpse of healthy ecosystems. And at some point, that's what this is about. It's frustrating for an individual to sit here and hear lawyers talk, and nothing against lawyers, but legalese is a strange language to me. And it sort of exemplifies how far we've come away from the original purpose of Act 250, and Elizabeth was here, she mistakenly said the defeat of the land use capability development plan. It was the fact that we didn't have a statewide land use plan to say this is where this is appropriate and this is where it's not appropriate. And now we're having, like theologians discussing angels dancing on the head of a pin. We've got attorneys in hearings and before the legislature, and I'm still wondering, can somebody tell me definitively and honestly what the purpose of Act 250 is, not only today, but going forward? And I haven't been able to write for about a year and a half, 2 years. I wrote something called the Mountain Manifesto, and this group published it, but I got a lot of material today. Maybe I'll start writing it because it gives me a lot of chance to think about it. And that's not to insult you at all. It's just to try to take this out of this room and place it in a larger perspective. And, you know, I took a picture of these birds here. You know, why do we put them there? To protect the glass or to protect birds? And yet, if we can rationalize so easy, blowing off the top of some of our most sensitive ecosystems, because somehow it's less horrible than something else, then I think we're losing the thread of what Act 250 or any of our environmental laws mean. And I'm sorry to express my frustration, but that's it. Thanks.
Thank you.
You got a live one here. Come sit up here.
Thank you. My name is Brooke Dingledine. I'm an environmental attorney. Who's practiced here in Vermont for about 23 years. I have practiced zoning, Act 250, and more recently, I practiced before the Public Utility Commission. I know there's a roadshow going around trying to determine, gee, how do we tweak Act 250? How do we improve it? From my perspective, and just to let you know, I have represented developers, I have represented municipalities, and I have represented neighbors, or as sometimes they're referred to, NIMBYs. I see this tweaking or this concern about Act 250, the environmental code and all of that, as fiddling while Rome is burning. The Public Utility Commission process, which is involved in massive, for example, industrial solar projects that are coming into the state that have nothing to do with generation of energy for Vermonters or for RECs. They're all being sold out of state. Massive projects of 110 acres, 195 solar panels, and then closing out the grid to the net meter projects and to the smaller folks that are actually employing Vermonters. The Public Utility Commission process imported the Act 250 criteria, I think with Mr. Tarrant's former law partner. I think Michael Marks was involved when he was at the Department of Public Service, advocated for that, so that the review at the Public Utility Commission for energy projects was similar to and mimicked the criteria in Act 250. The problem is that in Act 250, where citizens can be heard, they can come to a district commission, which is a panel of citizens, and then ultimately that case can be appealed to a law-trained judge court. If you prefer a panel, I enjoyed practicing before the environmental board. Wasn't a problem. I like the environmental court now because I know no matter what mistakes are made from a legal perspective, if once you get into court with predictable processes, with rules that are enforced, not a shell game of, well, the rules of evidence kind of apply, but then they don't when we don't feel like it. That's the problem that you see over at the Public Utility Commission today. You see a paper pushing process where lawyers put in pre-filed testimony for their experts. Why not just put in the expert's report, have a hearing, and let that person be cross-examined? If you need some discovery in the meantime, some limited process to that. The problem is that the Public Utility Commission, the developers, lawyers, write all of the pre-filed testimony, say all the right buzzwords, make sure that this cottage industry of experts, which is no longer a cottage industry, I would suggest that it's a manor house industry, where they just regurgitate and repeat the same aesthetics analysis. They just change the names, do a search and find and replace of the names of their clients. The Department of Public Service doesn't understand what their job is. Their job is to be a public advocate, not to come in and to hire experts at taxpayer expense to support the position of the applicant. Their job in rate cases, they understand. It's public interest, let's keep rates down. They understand what the dictate is. They get in these permitting processes, and they play judge, jury, and executioner as to whether or not they want to support or oppose a project. By the way, there's never been more than one, perhaps two, but now it's been reversed. One denial of a single project in the state of Vermont ever by the Public Utility Commission. Compare that to your Act 250 stats. Act 250, while it has its issues, it can be improved. Sometimes it's used by NIMBYs to make the processing of an application more expensive for a developer, and that needs to be curtailed. On the other hand, they need to be able to have a voice. I, as an attorney, have tried to help many citizens and municipalities go before the Public Utility Commission. Most people can't afford it. I do much of my work pro bono because the Department of Public Service is not protecting the public interest. Not that they should be required to come in and represent individuals in front of the Public Utility Commission. But when they hire an expert and tell me when they are spending taxpayer dollars, well, the applicant is part of the public, even though this person's from out of state, I have a problem with that. I have an issue with that. When folks come to me and say, help us with this process, and I say, how many tens of thousands of dollars do you have for me to get involved? I never had that problem in Act 250. You know, I tell people, you want to go up to the E-Court, you're going to spend $15,000, $20,000 minimum. But before the Public Utility Commission, $50,000 to $100,000. The paper pushing, the lawyering, they're no witnesses. They're a bunch of lawyers writing testimony back and forth and back and forth. You show up at a hearing. They've come in at that stage trying to help people. The developer puts in evidence that should never be allowed in by any tribunal. The gatekeeper function has been lost. They don't understand that just because somebody doesn't object to hearsay or completely incompetent, irrelevant evidence, they let it in anyway because nobody is objecting. The department isn't objecting because they have young lawyers that haven't been in courtrooms. And they're in a process that has turned into such a bureaucracy that it is impossible for the public to have a voice. I know you're focused on Act 250. De novo review is essential. Many of my clients are small developers, small business people who go to the district commission by themselves. They present their case. They may or may not have a bunch of experts. If it gets appealed beyond that, then they have to get real and they have to hire the people that they need at greater expense and usually to have an attorney at that level. But if you create more cost, less access, it is not serving anyone. With reasonable controls, and I believe either a law-trained judge or people, if you're considering a board or a panel again, people who have the expertise to be able to get information and apply the law to the facts that are before them so that appropriate, consistent, reliable, and predictable results come from that, not helter-skelter because one district commission is very professional because they're in a large populated area and one that's in a more rural area has a couple people because they can't find anybody really to sit who have expertise on those panels. So integrity in terms of the credentials, the background, the experience, and the capability of whoever the decision makers are is really essential. Not political appointees just because they helped me on my campaign. That doesn't serve anyone. So that's why I gravitate towards being a trial attorney. That's what I learned on. I've been in criminal court, family court, civil court, and many administrative boards around the state. It is essential if we want to allow people to have access to the system and a voice for our communities to go to the issue of, are we really protecting the environment here? Or are we allowing a bunch of lawyers to micromanage a system and have their way because they write a better piece of paper than somebody else?
Thank you.
Were you here earlier discussing, the suggestion had been made that the environmental board might want to be, natural resources board, taking energy cases, and that's what you're advocating?
I think that that would be a very good idea, because what I see across the street at the PUC is a broken system. It truly is.
You want to say something, Jamie?
It was just a very brief comment in regards to something that you discussed before, and just while you're considering what Ernie brought up in Aaron's proposal on the shifting of the burden. This just goes back to something you talked about at the last meeting. Most of the criteria, but both of you to correct me if I'm wrong, I know at least there's very limited ones in which the burden at the district commission level is on party other than the applicant. But 8A, as we talked about last time, necessary wildlife habitat, the burden is actually on an opponent to demonstrate that significant necessary wildlife habitat will be imperiled. I just want to point out how unfair it would be if you set up kind of this new, shifting of the burden that we discussed. If the burden is on the opponent at the district commission phase, and then they have to go to the appellate level and continue to carry that burden. And that's why, in our opinion, it would make sense that you have the applicant having that initial burden of production persuasion. If then we want to appeal that, we need to prevail. And in the context of what Aaron was saying, I understand why you're having this conversation. I just want to highlight how it's a little not quite right if the burden is actually on the party other than the opponent from the beginning.
I can't remember, we covered that last time, we're gonna do that at the next meeting, go through the report, and I can't remember how we left it.
Well, what I took from the meeting was that you wanted to have the burden on 8A be changed so that it's on the applicant.
That's what I thought.
You didn't change, so the burden would also remain on the opponent on traffic, educational services, local governmental services, and the impact of growth criterion. So, I mean, we're talking district commission level.
Thank you.
So an interesting wrinkle, if you change the burden of proof on appeal, is that if it's the applicant who doesn't like the permit conditions on traffic, the applicant now will have the burden of proof on appeal.
Yeah.
So it doesn't, it's not all.
And with that, we meet again in a week, and I think
Room 11.
Room 11 next time. We need, everyone's got to read the report like now, the one we have today, and then Aaron and Ellen, when they get a chance, will incorporate the things we did today and send us a draft, hopefully with a little bit of time, but it might,
We're not going to have much time with Joe Friday.
It's not just talking. This should be captured.
Right, you need to and we still have hope. And I may, we're not going to make it.
I mean, that's great.
Yes.
And,
Right, right, just like, he's gonna just leave.
It's not the end of the world.
For $500 an hour, you can contract him. He's available at a rate of $500 an hour as a contractor.
Now you start drawing your.
Well, he won't work, but for $500 an hour, I'll bet he'll come back.